Imagine a place built for women, but designed for their destruction. A camp where mothers, students, nurses, and teenagers were stripped of their names and turned into numbers. Where the sound of boots on frozen ground meant another night of terror. And where some of the most horrific medical experiments in human history were carried out not by monsters from nightmares, but by ordinary people who chose cruelty over conscience. Picture thousands of women standing shoulder to shoulder in the cold dawn light, bones visible beneath striped cloth, waiting for an SS guard to decide who would work, who would suffer, and who would vanish forever. Imagine knowing that the next sound you hear might be your name called for an experiment, a punishment, or a transport to a place no one returned from. This is Ravensbruck, Hitler's forgotten camp for women, the largest in Nazi Europe, a place where survival depended on luck, courage, and the thin thread of hope that refused to die. What happened behind those fences is not just history. It is a warning, a whisper from the past that insists on being remembered. Stay with me, because once you step inside Ravensbruck, you will understand why its story refuses to let go. Chapter 1. The Blueprint of Female Terror. Why Ravensbruck was built. It begins with a silence that should feel peaceful, the kind of quiet you hear near a lake in northern Germany, where the mist clings to the water and the wind moves slowly through the pines. But in the late 1930s, that silence was about to be broken forever. If you stood there, on the edge of the calm Schwed Sea, you would hear a different sound rising over the horizon. Not waves, not birds, the echo of hammers, the grind of trucks, voices barking commands. It is the sound of an idea being built into reality, an idea designed not to shelter, but to destroy. Ravensbruck did not appear by accident. It was engineered long before the first brick touched the ground. What makes this beginning so unsettling is how ordinary the decision seemed inside the offices of the SS. A camp for women. That is what Heinrich Himmler called it when he first sketched the plan. A model camp, he said. Efficient, orderly, controlled. On paper, it looked clinical, a list of measurements, transport routes, housing blocks, fences. But behind those measurements was an obsession. Himmler believed that women who did not fit into the Nazi vision of the perfect German mother were a threat that needed to be contained. The regime already had camps for men, yet the Nazi ideology demanded more. Women seen as asocial, political rebels, Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, and eventually Jewish women. These are the ones the state wanted removed quietly, out of sight, out of mind. In Nazi ideology, a woman's purpose was brutally simple. Reproduce for the Reich, obey your husband, follow the rules. But reality does not bend so easily. Women resisted. Women spoke out. Women refused to conform. And because the regime feared disobedience almost as much as invasion, it decided that the answer was architectural. Build a camp that would break them. Build a place where their defiance would be crushed, measured, cataloged, and erased. The idea started to crystallize years earlier when Lichtenberg, an early women's camp, began to overflow. The SS found themselves with more prisoners than their crude facilities could handle. But overcrowding alone was not the problem. The deeper concern was that Lichtenberg was not designed the way Himmler envisioned a modern SS camp. He wanted something new, a place that reflected the racial theories being drawn up in academic offices, where scholars twisted biology into propaganda. Himmler wanted efficiency, control, a space engineered for surveillance, punishment, and obedience, built right into the ground. This is where Ravensbruck's story truly begins. Not at the fence, but in the meeting rooms where architects unrolled their blueprints. They worked under the glow of dim lamps, tracing lines that would one day become walls, towers, and barracks. These were not just construction plans. They were ideological diagrams. Engineers asked how many women could fit into a barracks, how far the fence should be from the lake, how many watchtowers were needed to guarantee no blind spots. Every detail served a purpose. Every measurement expressed a belief. If you look closely at the earliest sketches, you can see something chilling. The layout resembles a factory. Long rectangles for barracks. a wide square for roll call, storage spaces for supplies, administrative buildings. It was designed to process human beings the way one might process metal, or wool, or grain. The camp structure announced its purpose without a single spoken word. Women would arrive, be sorted, be worked, be punished, be broken. While architects traced lines, Himmler's deputies drafted categories of those who would soon fill the camp. They identified political opponents, women who handed out leaflets, who whispered criticism, who refused to salute. They listed Jehovah's Witnesses, targeted for their refusal to swear loyalty to Hitler. They added Roma women, whom the Nazis labeled racially inferior. And even early on, before the final solution became official policy, Jewish women were marked for deportation. The categories expanded, week after week, until the list no longer reflected crimes, but the regime's fears. Imagine the moment Himmler examined the final proposal. A commander's room filled with cigarette smoke, men leaning over plans spread across a wooden table. Himmler taps his finger on the map. A location is chosen, a rural stretch of land near the quiet village of Ravensbruck. A place far enough from Berlin to hide its purpose, but close enough for efficient transport. Surrounded by dense forests, with a lake on one side, it would be easy to guard, hard to escape, and even harder for the outside world to stumble upon. But the choice of location was not just strategic. It was symbolic. The Nazis liked the idea of building their model women's camp amidst natural beauty, a way to contrast what they saw as purity with what they labeled impurity, women who dared to defy them. They believed the camp would purge Germany of unwanted elements, just as the lake and woods represented the beauty of their imagined racial ideal. They wanted Ravensbrück to be a physical embodiment of cleansing, order, and control. As plans progressed, the architects returned with new questions. How high should the electric fence be? How wide should the roll call square stretch? How many dogs should the SS train for patrol? Each answer tightened the blueprint until the camp took shape not just as a prison, but as an ecosystem of oppression. And there, at the center of these plans, stood the SS women who would eventually run much of the daily brutality. They were being recruited and trained even before the camp existed. The regime wanted female guards who embodied Nazi femininity, obedient, disciplined, unwavering in their loyalty. Himmler believed that women could be just as effective, just as ruthless, and sometimes even more zealous than the men. Ravensbrück would prove him right. By the winter of 1938, preparations had accelerated. Trucks carrying building materials rolled through the narrow village roads. Local residents watched from their windows, sensing that the world they knew was changing, but not yet understanding how completely. Laborers, many of them prisoners from Sachsenhausen, were forced to level the ground, pour foundations, and raise the walls that would eventually imprison tens of thousands of women. The cold bit into their hands as they worked. The smell of wet cement and diesel drifted across the fields. The sound of hammering blended with the distant calls of birds that had no idea what was being built beneath them. As the walls rose, so did the regime's ambition. The camp would not only enforce discipline, it would reshape behavior. The Nazis believed women who lived outside their prescribed roles were dangerous. Prostitutes, homeless women, those with relationships the state disapproved of, those who refused to bear children for the Reich, those who helped political resistance groups. In Nazi eyes, these women required re-education, and Ravensbrück was where that re-education would take place through forced labor, punishment, and constant surveillance. Even the early descriptions used by the SS reveal the mindset behind the camp. They called its future prisoners vagrants, troublemakers, politically unreliable. These were labels designed to strip away humanity. And once humanity is removed, cruelty becomes easier to administer. The blueprint of the camp was not just architectural, it was psychological. Meanwhile, inside the SS training schools for women, something darker was developing. Female recruits were taught to view prisoners not as people, but as threats to the stability of the Reich. They practiced drills, studied racial theory, and learned punishment protocols. They were told that showing kindness was weakness, that showing mercy was betrayal. They were encouraged to be firm, commanding, and cold. Many embraced these expectations eagerly. They believed they were stepping into positions of authority that society previously denied them. In a twisted way, Ravensbruck offered them power. As construction entered its final phase, the camp began to resemble the blueprint almost perfectly. Barbed wire encircled the perimeter. Floodlights were mounted near the towers. Wooden barracks lined the interior like teeth. The roll call square stretched across the center, an open space where thousands of women would soon stand for hours, rain or snow, punished by weather and exhaustion. Inside the administrative building, desks were arranged, ledgers prepared, and uniforms hung neatly, waiting for the first prisoners who were already arriving in transport lists. The Nazis admired the camp before it even opened. To them, it was a triumph of planning, a precise instrument of social engineering, a model of future camps. But if you were to stand there, on the morning the final fence was locked, you would feel something else entirely. A heaviness in the air. The smell of fresh cut would mix with the metallic tang of barbed wire. The electricity humming through the perimeter fence. The distant rumble of a truck carrying the first group of women who had no idea what awaited them. The truth is that Ravensbruck was built not simply to punish actions, but to punish identities. To break spirits. To enforce silence. To erase difference. Every plank of wood, every bolt in the fence, every stone in the tower was placed with that purpose in mind. And as the SS prepared to receive the first transport, the ideological blueprint was complete. The camp was ready, but the story does not end with its construction. In fact, the most horrifying part of the blueprint has not yet unfolded. Because once the gates opened and the first women were forced inside, the camp would become something even more sinister than its designers anticipated. A laboratory of cruelty. A training ground for future female SS guards. A place where thousands would vanish without a trace, their voices echoing only in the testimonies of those who survived. And as the first truck appeared on the horizon, dust rising behind its wheels, the guards stepped into position. The camp breathed for the first time, and the era of Ravensbruck, its terror, its experiments, its punishments was about to begin. Chapter 2. Building the Camp. From Lakeside Village to Machine of Oppression, 1938 to 1939. If you were standing in the village of Ravensbruck in the winter of 1938, you might not immediately understand what you were seeing. A line of trucks crawling along the narrow forest roads. The clang of metal echoing across the frozen lake. Men in striped uniforms moving under guard, shovels scraping against hard ground. It would all look strangely out of place among the quiet cottages and frost-covered pines. Yet the villagers could sense that something enormous, something heavy and dark, was settling over their home. The air itself felt different, as if the landscape was holding its breath. This was the moment when a simple lakeside village began transforming into the largest women's concentration camp in Nazi Europe, engineered not just for confinement, but for exploitation, punishment, and complete domination. Construction began before many locals realized it. The SS wanted secrecy at first, though secrecy was impossible to maintain once dozens of trucks began grinding through the dirt roads every morning. Orders had come from Berlin, signed by Himmler himself. The new women's camp had to reflect the ideals of the SS. Precision, efficiency, absolute control. It must be vast. It must be expandable. And it must be isolated enough that what happened behind its fences would remain unseen. The chosen location, just outside the quaint village of Ravensbruck, was perfect. A long peninsula of land hugged by the Schwetzee Lake on one side and dense woodland on the other. Natural barriers, natural concealment, natural boundaries for a place designed to sever thousands of women from the world they once knew. The earliest crews on the site were not German engineers, but prisoners, men taken from Sachsenhausen, forced into labor before the camp even existed. Their breath rose in pale clouds as they swung pickaxes into frozen soil. Their striped uniforms clung to skin that had long since stopped feeling the cold. Guards shouted at them to move faster, even though the ground was nearly stone. The prisoners dug trenches for sewage, hammered stakes for foundations, and hauled timber until their hands split open. One of them later said the earth there felt like it didn't want to be disturbed, as if the land itself resisted what it was becoming. But the SS pushed forward relentlessly. They erected a temporary wooden shack to serve as an office. Inside, officers unrolled blueprints across a rough table, weighing down the corners with stones. The documents showed the first skeletal outline of Ravensbruck. Long rectangular barracks arranged like ribs, a central roll call square, a perimeter fence tracing a sharp, unnatural curve around the future prisoner zone. Every line drawn on those papers meant another layer of oppression that would soon take physical form. Local villagers saw the prisoners first, a strange, unsettling sight in a rural community where life had always been quiet. Men who were clearly exhausted, gaunt, and watched closely by armed SS. Some villagers whispered that these workers must have been criminals. Others turned away, not wanting to ask questions whose answers might endanger them. And some simply tried to ignore the entire spectacle, telling themselves that the government surely had its reasons. That was how the SS preferred it, a mix of fear and apathy powerful enough to guarantee silence. As winter thawed into early spring, the sight changed rapidly. Wooden barracks began to rise from the ground, their planks smelling of fresh sap. The hammering never stopped, day or night. Even in darkness, lanterns lit the work zones while prisoners dragged load after load of stone and timber. The construction had a strange rhythm, almost mechanical, as if the land itself were becoming part of the Nazi war machine. And above it all, on a slight rise overlooking the camp, the skeletal frame of the future SS command headquarters took shape, positioned deliberately to give its occupants a full view over every inch of the women's compound that would soon be below them. The camp expanded outward with ruthless efficiency. The perimeter fence went up next, beginning as simple posts hammered deep into the ground. Then coils of barbed wire were stretched between them, pulled so tight they hummed when the wind blew. Eventually, the electric wiring would be added, a deadly, near-invisible current that turned the boundary into a weapon. And beyond the wire, guard towers began rising, tall wooden structures with narrow windows perfect for aiming rifles down onto the prisoners. Each tower creaked as it settled into place, like a giant exhaling after taking its first breath. Inside the developing camp, the alignment of buildings followed SS logic. That meant symmetry, straight lines, no dark corners where someone could hide, no wasted space. The barracks were constructed long and narrow, each able to hold several hundred women, though later they would cram far more into them. The windows were placed high, allowing air in, but preventing escape. The floors were bare wood, the kind that grew slick with frost in winter and swarmed with insects in summer. Every structure was built quickly, cheaply, and brutally, designed for function rather than humanity. But perhaps the single most important structure in the camp was the roll call square, known as the Appellplatz. It stretched wide and flat at the center of the camp, a place where women would one day stand for hours, sometimes entire nights, motionless in the rain or snow while guards counted and recounted them. It was a stage for punishment, intimidation, and psychological warfare. Its construction was overseen personally by SS officers who understood that this square would become the heartbeat of control inside Ravensbruck. Beyond the main prisoner compound, additional buildings rose to support the SS infrastructure. There were kennels for the dogs that would later be used to terrorize women during work details. There was an infirmary, not to heal prisoners, but to sort them, experiment on them, and determine who was fit enough for labor. There were workshops, warehouses, and garages. Step by step, the camp was growing into a self-contained world, governed entirely by SS rules, engineered to crush resistance before it could form. Meanwhile, the female SS recruits who would later run much of the daily brutality were training just a short distance away. They visited the construction site regularly, observing the future environment in which they would exercise authority. These young women, some in their early 20s, walked along the unfinished paths with notebooks in hand, learning the geography of the camp before any prisoner ever arrived. They studied how visibility worked from each tower, how far sound carried across the square, where shadows fell at dusk. They were preparing not merely to guard, but to dominate. Some of these recruits came from rural villages, others from cities. Many joined because they wanted status, a uniform, a salary. Few imagined they would become instruments of cruelty, until the SS taught them that cruelty was part of the job. Their instructors drilled into them the belief that prisoners were enemies of the Reich, unworthy of sympathy or hesitation. They were told to maintain discipline at all costs. By the time the camp opened, many of these women had embraced their roles with shocking enthusiasm. As spring warmed into summer, the camp began to resemble something close to its final form. The smell of sawdust lingered in the air. The lake shimmered just beyond the fence, its beauty now tainted by the harsh outlines of guard towers reflected on the water. A faint hum of electricity pulsed through the perimeter wires, and outside the camp gates, the village continued with its routines, farmers tending their fields, children walking to school, while just beyond their sight, one of the darkest institutions in Nazi Germany was rising plank by plank. The SS paid close attention to scheduling, pushing the prisoner laborers to build faster. They wanted the camp open by the spring of 1939, and so the pace intensified. Trucks carrying gravel and cement clogged the roads. Prisoners forced to carry wooden beams staggered under the weight, their ankles sinking deep into the softening mud. Guards barked orders, the crack of a whip slicing through the air whenever someone slowed. The worksite was brutal in summer, with swarms of insects clinging to sweat-soaked uniforms and dust coating every breath. One prisoner later recalled how the sound of construction became as constant as heartbeat. Hammer, 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 until he could hear it even in his sleep. He said the hardest moment was not the physical labor, but the knowledge that what they were building would destroy lives. We were building a place for suffering, he said. We knew that every nail we struck would become part of someone's misery. By late summer, the SS began the final preparations. The administration building received its furniture. Typewriters were placed on desks, each machine destined to stamp out paperwork that would seal thousands of women's fates. Filing cabinets were prepared to store prisoner records, names, numbers, punishments, labor assignments. Uniforms were delivered for the guards, along with rifles, ammunition, and batons. The camp even had a small prison within the prison, a bunker where women would later be tortured, held in darkness, or left without food for days. Outside the gates, a new road was completed, one designed specifically to bring in transports from across Germany and later from occupied Europe. This road was smooth, wide, and efficient, built for trucks carrying hundreds of women who would never return home. Even before the camp opened, planners anticipated the constant flow of prisoners, as if they already knew that the war would soon expand the camp far beyond its original capacity. In early 1939, word quietly spread among SS leadership. Ravensbruck was ready. Inspectors came to evaluate it, walking the perimeter with hands behind their backs, nodding approvingly at the precise lines of the barracks and the imposing height of the towers. They studied the electric fence, tested the locks, reviewed guard rotations. When they finished, they declared the camp fit for operation, a perfect embodiment of the SS vision. The final days before opening carried an eerie calm. The building stood empty, waiting for the women who would soon fill them. Inside the barracks, the wooden bunk frames were still clean, untouched by the sweat, fear, and sickness that would soon seep into them. The Appellplatz was silent, the guard towers unmanned, but the world around the camp could feel that something was coming. A storm gathering behind walls that looked new and harmless only from a distance. The first transport lists were drawn up in Berlin. Women from Lichtenberg were chosen to be transferred to the new camp. Political prisoners, asocial women, Jehovah's Witnesses who refused to renounce their beliefs. Many of them had no idea they were being moved to a place built specifically for them, a place designed from the ground up to tighten the SS grip around their lives. As the opening day approached, the guards rehearsed their routines. They practiced lining up prisoners who were not yet there. They marched across the square, saluted the command building, tested the gates, rehearsed punishments. The empty camp echoed with their footsteps, like a rehearsal for a play that would soon feature thousands of terrified women as unwilling actors. Finally, the morning arrived. The gates rolled open. A truck appeared in the distance, bouncing along the road constructed for this exact moment. Inside the camp, officers took their positions, standing with rigid posture, ready to assert dominance over the first women who would be forced onto the gravel yard. The camp inhaled, as if drawing breath for the horrors it would unleash. And as the truck drew closer, exhaust drifting behind it like a dark banner, the villagers watching from afar felt a cold weight settle over them. Something final. Something irreversible. Ravensbruck was no longer just a construction site. It was ready to function, ready to imprison, ready to become a machine of oppression. The women inside that first transport had no idea that the structures rising above them were built with such precision, such deliberation, such cruelty. They did not yet know the routines, the punishments, the labor, the hunger, the terror that would fill their days. They only saw the towers, the fence, the watching eyes of the guards. And as the truck slowed to a stop and the gates closed behind them with a metallic clang that echoed across the lake, the true story of Ravensbruck, its suffering, its resistance, its brutality, was just beginning. Chapter 3. The arrival of the first prisoners and the birth of camp routine. The first women stepped out of the trucks before dawn, when the light was still gray and thin and the cold seemed to press directly into their bones. Ravensbruck looked unfinished to them. Fresh lumber, muddy ground, piles of gravel still waiting to be spread. But the parts that matter were already complete. The fence, the towers, the guards, the dogs. The women who arrived that morning in May 1939 had no idea they were walking into a place that would one day hold more than 100,000 prisoners. All they knew was the sound of the gates slamming shut behind them, a metallic finality that swallowed the last bit of the outside world. Many of these first prisoners came from Lichtenberg, the earlier women's camp that the SS had outgrown. They were political dissidents, social workers, teachers, communists, Jehovah's Witnesses, prostitutes, women accused of asocial behavior, and those caught in the widening net of Nazi moral policing. They had spent months, sometimes years, under SS control already, but Ravensbruck was different. It felt larger, colder, more deliberate. One woman later described it as a camp built for something the SS had not yet dared to attempt. The guards seemed more disciplined, the fences more imposing, the space more controlled. Though they did not yet know it, they were stepping into a camp designed with a specific purpose in mind, to break women not through chaos, but through order. The first day was a shock of noise and motion, dogs barking, guards shouting, boots thudding on the muddy ground. The women were herded toward the administration building, where their names were taken, their belongings confiscated, and their identities reduced to numbers. The SS clerks worked quickly, stamping documents, assigning categories, giving each woman a colored triangle stitched to her uniform. Red for political prisoners, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, black for so-called asocial women, green for criminals. And soon others would follow. Yellow stars, brown triangles, pink badges. This rainbow of cruelty was meant to divide them, to fracture solidarity before it could form. The uniforms they received were rough, coarse, and cold. Striped dresses that barely fit, shoes with soles so thin they offered no protection from the gravel. They were not given time to adjust. Immediately, they were ordered to stand in formation on the Appellplatz. The sky was still early morning gray, and a damp mist curled up from the lake. The ground was wet, soft, sinking beneath their feet. The guards paced the rows, checking posture, correcting stance, barking orders with a sharpness many women had not heard even in Lichtenberg. Then came the indoctrination. The rules were shouted at them. No talking during roll call, no looking guards in the eye, no stepping out of line, no refusing orders. Punishments would be swift and merciless. The women were forced to repeat certain phrases to demonstrate obedience. The guards emphasized that this was a model camp and that discipline must be perfect. Behind their words hid a message more chilling. Ravensbruck was not an ordinary prison. It was a laboratory of power. As the sun rose higher, work assignments began. Even though the camp was still under construction, the SS wasted no time putting prisoners to labor. Some were sent to carry heavy stones across the compound. Others were ordered to clean the barracks, polish floors that would soon be covered in dirt and footprints. A few were tasked with breaking down piles of timber, sorting nails, clearing paths. The work was grueling, the pace relentless. Any hesitation brought a blow from a stick or the snap of a dog's jaws inches from their legs. The first meals revealed the starvation that would become routine. Watery soup with floating shreds of cabbage, a small piece of bread, sometimes a thin smear of margarine. The women ate quickly, instinctively, knowing the guards could end the meal at any moment. Hunger settled into them like a second skin. By nightfall, many felt a dizziness that would never fully leave. Inside the barracks, disaster greeted them. Though newly built, the structures were bare and freezing. Wooden bunks, stacked 3 high, ran the length of the walls. Thin straw mattresses lay across them, some torn before they were ever used. Dirty blankets were tossed onto the bunks without order. Windows sat high and narrow, letting in little light. Lice were already present, hiding in the mattresses and blankets from the first group of laborers who'd slept there during construction. It did not take long for infestations to begin, but the real shock was the proximity. Women were packed so tightly that turning over in their sleep meant bumping into the person beside them. Privacy vanished instantly. Some cried softly the first night. Others stared at the ceiling, unable to process the sudden collapse of their world. A few tried to whisper encouragement, only to be silenced by fear of being heard by guards patrolling outside. Morning brought the first full official roll call. The guards blew whistles while it was still dark. The women stumbled into formation, their shoes squelching in mud, their breaths steaming in the cold air. Roll call lasted hours. The SS counted slowly, deliberately. Any mistake, any woman fainting or stepping out of line, meant the entire group would remain standing until the guards were satisfied. Some women collapsed from exhaustion. Others were beaten for trying to help them. The Appellplatz became a stage where the SS displayed their power, and where the women learned that survival required endurance beyond imagination. But even amid terror, patterns began to form. Small routines emerged from the chaos. Prisoners whispered names at night. They discovered who was from which region. They helped each other find space on the bunks. They shared bits of bread. They hid mothers who were too weak to stand. These quiet acts of solidarity might seem small, but in a place designed to crush spirits, they were a form of defiance. The first weeks were filled with confusion, as the SS figured out their own systems. Schedules shifted. Work assignments changed suddenly. Guards tested different methods of control. The routine that would later dominate daily life was not yet solidified, but the foundations were there. Wake before dawn. Roll call. Work. Roll call again. A meager meal. Work. An evening roll call. Then a restless night filled with coughing, whispers, and the scurrying of lice and mice across the wooden floors. During this early phase, the SS women guards began asserting their authority with a sharpness that surprised even some male officers. Dorothea Binz, who would later become infamous for her cruelty, was already showing the traits that made prisoners fear her. She patrolled the work details with a calculated gaze, watching for any sign of weakness. Greta Bosch, another early guard, practiced drills that kept prisoners in constant motion. Many of the guards were young, some barely older than the prisoners themselves, but the uniform gave them a sense of power that needed little encouragement to turn to brutality. For the prisoners, adjusting to this new hierarchy was a matter of survival. They learned quickly which guards were unpredictable, which ones watched for the smallest infraction, which ones enjoyed inflicting pain. They learned how to move without drawing attention, how to speak only when necessary, how to hide fear behind a blank expression. The camps forced rapid adaptation. Those who adjusted too slowly were punished or worse. As more transports arrived, the camp grew crowded. New prisoners brought new rumors. That Ravensbruck was intended to replace Lichtenberg entirely. That more barracks were being built. That the camp would expand into something larger than any women's facility before it. Among the new arrivals were Roma women, Jehovah's Witnesses refusing to renounce their faith, and political prisoners transferred from prisons across Germany. Each group added a new layer of complexity to daily life, because the SS deliberately used these differences to sow division. They assigned barracks according to triangle color. They manipulated tensions, hoping to weaken any sense of unity. But something unexpected began to happen instead. Shared suffering drew many of these women together. A political prisoner might share her bread with a Roma woman too sick to stand. A Jehovah's Witness might help clean the wounds of a beaten communist. A group of women would huddle together at night for warmth, triangle colors forgotten in the darkness. The SS wanted to create separation. The prisoners often found connection. With expansion came new work details. Some women were forced to dig drainage trenches around the camp, the mud sucking at their shoes with every step. Others carried logs from the nearby forest, the bark tearing their palms. A few were assigned to early workshops, repairing uniforms and sewing patches. These positions were slightly safer, but they also required grueling precision. A missed stitch or drop needle could result in punishment. The guards invented new ways to control the women. They inspected barracks with white gloves, punishing entire groups for a single speck of dust. They introduced exercises meant to exhaust prisoners before work even began. They used dogs to terrorize women during outdoor labor. Every day brought a new method of establishing the hierarchy that would define Ravensbrück. One of the earliest arrivals later described the smell of the camp during those months. Wet wood, sweat, diesel, and something else. Fear, almost tangible, hanging in the air like mist. She said the sound she remembered most was the dogs growling at dawn, echoing across the square. Another said she never forgot the sight of the lake, impossibly calm beyond the fence, a reminder of the world she could no longer touch. The lake became a symbol of everything the prisoners had lost. The daily routine hardened over time, shaped by these early weeks. Dawn roll call, hours of standing motionless. Forced labor, a thin meal, more labor. Evening roll call, punishments. Night, repeat. Some women responded with quiet resistance, hiding sick prisoners during inspections or slowing their work just enough to sabotage production. Others simply tried to survive, counting the days without knowing what they were counting toward. And some, broken by the relentless pace, faded quickly, becoming shadows in their own bodies. As the weeks turned into months, the population grew. Ravensbruck expanded physically, new barracks rising like skeletal fingers across the ground. The rhythm of the camp, strict, punishing, suffocating, settled into place. The guards refined their methods. The SS officers perfected administrative procedures. The women learned how to move, how to speak, how to endure. But beneath this emerging routine lurks something darker. Rumors began to circulate about new facilities being planned. A medical block, a punishment bunker, workshops tied to German industry, a place that would experiment on prisoners. The women heard these whispers in the barracks at night, exchanged in hushed voices, carried from new arrivals who had seen things in other camps that defied belief. They didn't know which rumors were true. They didn't know how much worse things could get. They would learn soon enough. Because while the daily routine was settling into place, the SS was preparing for the next phase of Ravensbruck's evolution, a phase that would turn this camp from a prison into a site of unimaginable cruelty. The first prisoners had barely adjusted when new orders arrived from Berlin. The camp was about to expand, and what awaited the women in its next chapter would push Ravensbrück into an even darker realm, one where routine became torture and survival became a battle against forces far more sinister than anything they had yet seen. Chapter 4: SS Women. The Rise of Female Guards and the Machinery of Cruelty. The women who arrived at Ravensbrück in those first months believed they had already witnessed the full brutality of the Nazi regime. They had seen beatings, starvation, humiliation. They had been stripped of dignity, identity, home, and freedom. But they had not yet met the group that would come to define the camp's character. Not the male SS officers, not the dogs, not the commandant's barked orders. The soul of Ravensbrück, if it could be called a soul, was shaped by the women who patrolled its grounds, who enforced its rules, who carried out its punishments with disturbing eagerness. Female SS guards, Officerin, became the architects of daily terror, and their rise inside the Nazi system remains one of the most chilling and least understood chapters of the Holocaust. It begins quietly, almost deceptively, with the arrival of young women in crisp uniforms, stepping off buses near the camp gates. The villagers saw them long before the prisoners did. Women in tailored jackets, polished boots, and caps that seemed oversized on their youthful faces. Many were in their late teens or early 20s. They looked, from a distance, like clerks reporting for duty or secretaries attending a training seminar. Their faces were calm, sometimes even cheerful, as they walked past the construction work, past the barbed wire, toward the administration building. But if you look more closely, you might notice something harder in their eyes, a spark of entitlement, perhaps, or anticipation. They were entering a world that would give them power they had never imagined. Most of these guards did not join the SS out of coercion. The SS Women's Auxiliary was a voluntary force. They signed up for many reasons: steady pay, clean uniforms, authority, the allure of working for the regime that dominated the country. Some were attracted by Nazi ideology, raised in families who embraced racial doctrines. Others simply wanted jobs. But the system did not care why they came. Once they stepped into Ravensbrück, the SS would mold them into the enforcers it needed. Their training began nearby, at the SS Women's School in Fürstenberg, only a short walk from the camp itself. There, the recruits learned not just practical skills, maintaining order, issuing commands, writing reports, but the psychological framework that allowed cruelty to become routine. They were taught to see prisoners as dangerous, deceitful, subhuman. They were instructed never to let empathy interfere with discipline. An Officerin who hesitated, who questioned orders, who showed even a flicker of compassion, would be removed from duty. The ideal guard was strict, unwavering, confident, and ready to enforce punishment without hesitation. The training drills were relentless. Recruits marched through the woods until their boots blistered. They practiced shouting commands at imaginary prisoners lined up before them. They studied punishments, learning how to carry out beatings, how to restrain women during interrogations, how to spot insubordination. They learned to use dogs. The animals responded to commands only when given in a specific tone: sharp, stern, and absolute. Some recruits struggled with this transformation. Others embraced it with disturbing enthusiasm. When they finally entered the camp, the prisoners immediately noticed the difference between the male and female guards. The men barked orders, patrolled the towers, and supervised major operations. But the women, these young, surprisingly ordinary-looking women, inserted themselves into every corner of daily life. They stood in the roll call lines, inspecting posture. They supervised work details, punishing anyone who slowed or stumbled. They patrolled the barracks, checking for forbidden items, tearing apart personal belongings in sudden raids. They observed everything. Nothing escaped their attention. Prisoners later said that the female guards were often more unpredictable than their male counterparts. Some punished for noncompliance. Some punished for compliance. Some punished simply because they could. One survivor recalled that a guard once struck her because she stood too straight during roll call, as if standing tall implied defiance. Another woman was beaten because her shoes were too clean. The logic was inconsistent by design. Unpredictability created fear, and fear was an effective tool. Dorothea Binz embodied this terror. She arrived at Ravensbrück as a young woman barely out of adolescence, but she rose quickly through the ranks. Prisoners feared her before they ever heard her name. She moved with purposeful steps, her eyes scanning for weakness. She seemed to derive energy from issuing punishments. Some guards administered violence with cold detachment. Vins often looked pleased. Women were beaten until they collapsed. They were ordered to kneel in gravel for hours. They were forced to stand barefoot on snow while she observed, arms crossed, as if she were checking the progress of a crop. But Binz was not alone. Greta Bosel became known for selecting prisoners for transports that led to killing centers elsewhere. She gave orders with chilling casualness, choosing who would live and who would die with the same tone someone might use when assigning household chores. Elisabeth Volkenrath, who later served at Auschwitz, began honing her methods at Ravensbruck. These women were products of a system that nurtured their worst impulses and rewarded them with promotions, praise, and authority. Yet cruelty at Ravensbrück was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was quiet and insidious. An Aufseherin might deny a woman permission to use the latrine, forcing her to suffer humiliation. They might confiscate shoes in the dead of winter. They might withhold a prisoner's coat before roll call. They created small torments that added up, day after day, chipping away at resilience. One prisoner wrote after the war that the female guards destroyed us in 1,000 small ways that were harder to survive than the beatings. The SS hierarchy inside the camp placed these women directly above the prisoners, but below the male officers. This intermediate position created a constant power struggle. To prove their competence, many guards sought the approval of male superiors by demonstrating strictness. Some went further, displaying a brutality that surprised even the men. The competition for recognition fostered an environment where cruelty became a path to advancement. And yet, this was not mere ambition. There was ideology behind it. The Nazi worldview treated women differently than men, expecting them to be mothers, homemakers, guardians of racial purity. But inside Ravensbrück, all those expectations twisted into something else entirely. The female guards were not there to nurture, but to discipline, not to raise children, but to break spirits. Their femininity was weaponized, proof the SS believed that even women could uphold the regime's harshest ideals when properly trained. The prisoners struggled with the psychological shock of being dominated by other women. In traditional European society, women were not expected to wield violence in formal settings. To see young women in boots and uniforms, barking orders with absolute authority, disrupted every familiar pattern. Some prisoners tried to appeal to their humanity. They begged for mercy, hoping the shared experience of womanhood might soften the guards' hearts. But that hope was usually crushed. The guards responded with contempt, insisting that prisoners were not women like them. Not German, not pure, not worthy. The presence of female guards also created unique forms of harassment. Some developed personal vendettas, targeting prisoners they disliked. Others used humiliation as a tool, forcing women to undress during inspections, mocking their bodies, treating menstruation as a punishable offense. The cruelty was not only physical. It was intimate, invasive, designed to shatter dignity. The dogs were an extension of this power. Large German shepherds, trained to attack without hesitation, patrolled beside the guards. The women learned to control them with subtle signals, a flick of the wrist, a short command. Prisoners often said the dogs could sense fear. They lunged, snarled, snapped their jaws inches from trembling legs. Sometimes they were ordered to bite. The screams echoed across the work sites, then faded beneath the daily rhythm of the camp. For the guards, the camp became a world where ordinary rules did not apply. They lived in comfortable quarters, ate well, enjoyed evenings at the local cinema, attended dances, flirted with male SS officers, and returned each morning to oversee suffering. They lived dual lives, polite in town, monstrous in the camp. Villagers saw them laughing, shopping, drinking coffee. Prisoners saw them transform into something unrecognizable once they stepped through the gates. Yet not all guards were identical. A few displayed moments of hesitation, flickers of doubt. Some seemed uncomfortable with the more extreme punishments. But the system allowed no room for mercy. Guards who hesitated were transferred or reprimanded. The pressure to conform, to cruelty, to discipline, to ideology was overwhelming. And those who embraced the expectations rose quickly. The machinery of oppression rewarded obedience, not conscience. The guards' presence shaped the daily routine so intensely that the entire atmosphere of Ravensbrück began to reflect their personalities. The camp took on the coldness of Binz, the rigidity of Volkenrath, the cruelty of Bosel. Each guard left her mark. They turned roll call into a ritual of fear. They transformed work assignments into arenas of punishment. They made inspections into performances of dominance. Their footsteps became warnings. Their silhouettes in the barracks doorway meant danger. And as the camp grew, so did their power. More recruits arrived. More were trained. Ravensbruck became not only the largest women's concentration camp, but the main training center for female SS personnel across the entire Nazi camp system. Future guards for Auschwitz, Majdanek, Bergen-Belsen, and other camps learned their trade here. They learned how to control women, how to break them, how to enforce Nazi order. In this sense, Ravensbrück was not just a camp, it was a school of cruelty. The prisoners could not escape them. The guards' presence seeped into every moment, even the rare, quiet ones. At night, when the camp fell still, women whispered about them, trying to understand who they were. Some speculated that the guards were forced into their roles. Others insisted they enjoyed the power. But in truth, what mattered was not their motives but their impact. They were the ones who shaped daily life. They were the ones who decided which prisoners received beatings, which were assigned to deadly labor details, which were punished for imagined infractions. Over time, the guards grew harsher. As the camp population ballooned, their control tightened. They became quicker to strike, quicker to punish, quicker to escalate any perceived disobedience. And as more Jewish women arrived, as political prisoners from occupied Europe filled the barracks, the guards' ideological fervor intensified. The more diverse and crowded the prisoner population became, the more violently the SS responded. By late 1940, the Guard Corps had formed a hardened hierarchy. Senior guards supervised dozens of others. Punishments became systematized. Inspections were timed with military precision. The machinery of cruelty, initially improvised, now ran with chilling efficiency. The female SS guards had fully become what the system intended them to be. But beneath their iron exterior, tensions simmered. The war was expanding. The prisoners were increasing. The camp was evolving. And soon the Guard would face a new phase of their own training, one that would demand even greater brutality. For Ravensbrück was about to become not only a place of discipline and forced labor, but a site of medical experimentation, systematic murder, and industrial exploitation. The guards would be expected to enforce these new horrors with the same discipline they showed on the roll call square. Whether they were ready or not, the next chapter of Ravensbrück's darkness was coming. And the female guards, shaped by training, ideology, and ambition, would become central players in a nightmare that none of the women imprisoned there could yet imagine. Behind the fences, behind the towers, behind the cold eyes of the guards, Ravensbrück was preparing to descend into an even deeper level of terror. And for the prisoners, who already struggled to survive each day, the worst was still ahead. Chapter 5. Life and Death in the Barracks. Daily survival for 40,000 prisoners. The barracks at Ravensbrück looked ordinary from a distance. Long wooden buildings lined up in careful, rigid rows, their roofs sloping under the German sky. But stepping inside one for the first time was like stepping into another world, a world where air grew heavier, where the walls seemed to hold the echoes of every fear, every whisper, every nightmare. The first women who entered these barracks in 1939 had no idea that the buildings around them would one day hold more than 40,000 prisoners at a time, their bodies pressed together so tightly that breathing felt like a shared, desperate act. Ravensbrück's barracks were not built to house women. They were built to erase them. From the moment prisoners were shoved inside, The senses were overwhelmed. The smell hit first, an overpowering blend of sweat, unwashed bodies, mold, straw, and sickness. Even on the first night, before the camp reached its true scale, the stench was sharp and invasive. The windows were small and set high into the walls, letting in just enough light to reveal the contours of misery, but never enough to change it. Women stood in the doorway, trying to understand how they were supposed to live in such a place, their eyes adjusting to the dimness, their hands gripping the rough wood of the bunks. The bunks themselves were crude wooden frames stacked 3 high, each one covered with a thin, stained mattress stuffed with old straw that pricked through the fabric and irritated the skin. Blankets, if they could be called blankets, were coarse, itchy, and often damp. Prisoners were assigned to bunks without regard for age, illness, or nationality. A grandmother might sleep beside a teenager, a German political prisoner beside a Polish teacher, a Jehovah's Witness beside a Roma woman. The SS believed such mixing would create tension, but for many prisoners, these bonds became lifelines. The first nights were filled with sobbing, coughing, whispering, and the constant rustling of straw. Women clung to pieces of their old lives, memories of children, husbands, ordinary routines, before realizing how distant those lives had suddenly become. Some lay awake, frozen by fear, while others whispered prayers or recited poems under their breath to keep their sanity intact. Darkness inside the barracks felt absolute, a kind of darkness that swallowed everything. By morning, the barracks became instruments of suffering. Before dawn, guards blew whistles and shouted commands, forcing the women to rise from their bunks while their bodies were still stiff from cold and hunger. The floors were icy. Some women lost sensation in their feet by the time they stepped outside into the frozen air. The barracks emptied in a chaotic rush as prisoners scrambled to line up for roll call, tripping over loose planks, bumping into each other, fighting exhaustion that never truly left their bones. Roll call, appel, was the defining rhythm of life in Ravensbruck. It was not merely an administrative procedure. It was a weapon. The guards used it to break the women slowly, hour by hour. Sometimes roll call lasted 1 hour, sometimes 3. Sometimes, in the depths of winter, the women were forced to stand motionless for half the day, their limbs trembling, their teeth chattering, their breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. If a prisoner fainted, the guards kicked her until she stood upright again, or until the women beside her lifted her body to keep her from being beaten further. If someone died during roll call, her corpse remained standing in the line, propped up by the women around her, because the guards refused to end appel until the count matched their expectations. When roll call finally ended, the women staggered back toward the barracks to prepare for work. But there was no rest, no warmth, no time to gather strength. Inside the barracks, little had changed. The air remained thick, humid from the breath of hundreds of women sleeping without ventilation. Lice swarmed in the straw. Bedbugs hid in the wooden slats. Fleas crawled across skin and clothing. The scratching never stopped. Infection spread easily. Boils, sores, rashes. Some women tore at their skin until it bled, desperate for relief. Ravensbruck was designed with starvation as a central pillar of control. Breakfast was barely a meal, a watery, bitter brew they called coffee but contained no coffee, only roasted barley or acorns. If bread was given, it was a thin slice, sometimes moldy, often stale. The women ate it quickly, their bodies trembling with hunger even as they swallowed. Food became a currency, a memory, an obsession. Some prisoners dreamed of bread. Others hoarded crumbs in hidden pockets. Many licked bowls long after they were empty, trying to catch the last hint of nourishment. Then came work. The SS assigned women to labor details with the kind of detachment one might use when sorting tools. Some were sent to carry stones, their backs straining under impossible weight. Others cleared land, dug trenches, built new barracks, or hauled logs through mud that sucked at their ankles like quicksand. Many collapsed. Some were helped to their feet by fellow prisoners. Others were beaten until they stood, or until they stopped moving altogether. Inside the barracks, the daily torture took subtler forms. Inspections were a constant threat. Guards burst in without warning, storming through the bunks, tearing blankets aside, searching for forbidden items, an extra piece of bread, a scrap of paper, a needle, a photograph. Anything remotely personal was confiscated. Sometimes the guards overturned entire bunks just to assert dominance. One guard, notorious among prisoners, once destroyed an entire barracks bedding because she found a single loose thread on one woman's blanket. The barracks also amplified the psychological war waged against the prisoners. Fear was ever present. The sound of boots approaching sent waves of terror through the room. A guard's silhouette in the doorway could silence hundreds of women instantly. Punishments were often administered inside the barracks, beatings that echoed through the wooden walls, screams that cut through the night. Women learned to listen carefully for footsteps, to decipher the difference between a guard approaching for inspection and a guard approaching for punishment. Illness spread rapidly. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, influenza. Each disease found fertile ground in the overcrowded barracks. Sick women were often left untreated unless they were too ill to work, and by then, the infirmary offered little more than a slower death. The smell of sickness mixed with the smell of unwashed bodies until it became impossible to distinguish one from the other. Many prisoners learned to recognize illness first by scent, then by sight. Yet amid this darkness, something remarkable emerged, an unspoken system of care. Women tended to each other quietly, risking punishment to offer comfort. They shared blankets, traded food, cleaned wounds, and whispered stories to keep hope alive. They formed tiny communities within the chaos. Polish women helping German communists, French women aiding Roma mothers, Jewish women comforting those from other nations who did not yet understand what lay ahead. These small acts of solidarity, fragile, dangerous, but powerful, became the heartbeat of survival. Some women even tried to maintain fragments of their old identities. A teacher might recite lessons from memory. A nurse might teach others how to prevent infection. Mothers soothed children with lullabies. Older prisoners, who remembered previous eras of war and poverty, offered wisdom. The barracks became an unlikely classroom, a place where learning and memory resisted the SS attempt to strip everything away. Night brought a different kind of torment. Sleep was almost impossible. Snores mixed with coughing. Women twitched from hunger. Some cried into their blankets, trying to muffle the sound. Others shivered uncontrollably, their bodies unable to generate enough heat. The barracks creaked as wind pushed against the thin walls, and every sound, every scream from outside, every whistle blown by a guard, every distant dog bark, kept sleep at bay. Sometimes prisoners talked quietly, though whispering was forbidden. They told each other stories from their childhoods. They described meals they'd once cooked, homes they once kept warm, the faces of children they hoped to see again someday. Some shared jokes, dark humor forged from desperation. Others spoke of politics, of resistance, of the belief that the Nazis could not win forever. These conversations were sparks in the darkness, brief moments of humanity that the SS had tried to extinguish. But the barracks were not only a place of suffering and solidarity. They were also a place of selection. The SS constantly scanned the lines, looking for women who appeared too weak to work, too sick to be useful, too exhausted to continue. These women were often dragged from their bunks at night or pulled from work details during the day. The barracks became witness to the disappearance of hundreds, then thousands. One day their bunk would be full, the next day empty. No explanation, no farewell, only absence. As more transports arrived, the barracks swelled far beyond their intended capacity. What had once housed 200 women now held 800. Prisoners slept on floors, on tables, on scraps of cloth in corners. Some slept sitting up, others lay in shifts, one woman resting while another worked, rotating through bunk space like factory workers in a grotesque assembly line of exhaustion. The sound of breathing alone became overwhelming. Hundreds of lungs pulling in stale air, coughing it back out. The heat of bodies made the barracks suffocating even in winter. Women staggered from bunks gasping, desperate for air. But outside, the cold cut deeply, stealing warmth the moment they stepped beyond the doorway. There was no environment in Ravensbruck that offered comfort, only different versions of suffering. And yet, within these same walls, something extraordinary persisted. Hope. It came in small flashes, a smuggled message from a nearby village, a rumor of Allied advances, the arrival of a new prisoner bringing news from the outside world. Even the smallest glimmer, a whisper that Germany was losing battles, a photograph hidden in a shoe, a letter read in secret, could revive spirits for weeks. The barracks were both prison and refuge. They were where women were broken, but also where they learned to survive. They were where life clung to its last threads, and where resilience grew in defiance of every SS attempt to crush it. The women of Ravensbruck created rituals to maintain sanity. They brushed each other's hair to reduce lice. They sang softly before sleeping. They stitched hidden pockets into their clothing. They remembered birthdays. They prayed together. They kept track of time, even though the SS tried to deny them clocks, calendars, and seasons. Every act of humanity became resistance. But by 1941, the barracks were no longer merely overcrowded. They were overflowing. New constructions appeared. More guards were stationed. New routines were implemented. The SS was preparing for something bigger, something darker. And, as the number of prisoners grew, the camp shifted from a place of punishment to a place of exploitation. The barracks would become the starting point for labor assignments that killed thousands. They would become the holding area for women selected for medical experiments. They would become the place where mothers were forced to hide their children or watch them die. The SS guards who patrolled these buildings grew more violent, more inventive in cruelty, more committed to the ideology that supported the camp. And the women inside, crushed yet unbroken, sensed a change in the air. Something was coming, because Ravensbruck was about to enter its next phase, a phase defined not by daily suffering alone, but by systematic torture and industrial-scale brutality. The barracks that already felt too full, too loud, too suffocating, too cruel, were about to become the epicenter of even greater horrors. Chapter 6: Mothers, Children, and the Destruction of Family Bonds. It began with the smallest human sound, an infant's cry echoing somewhere inside a place built to silence every trace of tenderness. When the first child's wail pierced the cold air at Ravensbruck, even some of the guards looked startled. A baby had no place in a concentration camp, and yet, by 1940, babies were arriving, carried by mothers shaking from exhaustion, hidden beneath coats, clung to in desperation during transports. Some were born inside the barracks, their first breath drawn in a room where death hung in the air like dust. Others were dragged across the camp gates in their mother's arms, wide-eyed toddlers too young to understand the world they had just entered. And for the women of Ravensbruck, motherhood, the thing that Nazi ideology publicly celebrated, became one of the greatest dangers a prisoner could carry. If you were a woman arriving at Ravensbruck with a child, the moment you stepped off the truck, fear tightened its grip on your heart. You held your child close, trying to block her from the guard's eyes. You whispered that everything would be all right even as your own voice shook. But the SS saw children differently. To them, a child was not a life to protect. A child was a burden, an inconvenience, an unfit mouth that consumed food without producing labor. The Nazis claimed to champion motherhood, but only for Aryan women. Any mother who did not fit their racial ideal, Jewish, Roma, political dissident, was an enemy whose child posed a threat to their vision of a pure Germany. Inside the camp, the presence of children created a kind of tension unlike anything the women had known. The barracks that already overflowed with suffering now held the fragile heartbeat of infants. Cries pierced the night. Mothers tried to hush them, terrified that the sound would attract guards. Some women stuffed cloth into their own mouths to keep themselves from sobbing too loudly near the babies. Others sat upright through the night, holding their children, afraid to sleep because children too often died in their mother's arms before morning. The guards made their cruelty clear quickly. They treated babies as if they were pests. Some guards kicked cradles aside. Others mocked crying infants. One guard was known to strike mothers simply because their child whimpered during roll call. But the most chilling reality was the deliberate lack of care given to infants born inside the camp. There was no milk, no diapers, no medical help. Babies were placed in cold corners of the barracks, thin blankets wrapped around them barely offering warmth. They starved slowly, their bodies shrinking, their cries becoming softer each day until finally they ceased. For many mothers, the worst moment came during registration. The SS clerks looked at the infants with blank expressions, then wrote a single word beside the mother's name, kind, meaning child. That word would haunt her. It meant extra scrutiny. It meant suspicion. It meant danger. The SS believed that children were distractions that made mothers less efficient workers, and inefficient workers were disposable. Women with children often ended up on the list for transports. They didn't know then what those transports meant. They would learn soon enough. The stories of childbirth inside Ravensbruck are some of the most harrowing testimonies to survive the camp. Imagine a barrack with hundreds of women packed shoulder to shoulder. No sterile room, no doctor, no clean water. When a mother went into labor, the women around her formed a small ring, shielding her from view. They whispered encouragement, held her hands, used torn pieces of clothing to wipe her forehead. Older women acted as midwives, drawing on memories from villages far from this nightmare. Babies were born onto dirty straw, their mothers' cries muffled by fear of being heard. Some infants took their first breath. Others did not. Those that survived were placed beside their mothers on the bunks, fragile as autumn leaves. But the SS did not allow these tiny lives to continue for long. Starvation was policy. Babies received no rations. Mothers shared what little bread they had, even if it meant their own collapse. And yet the infants died by the hundreds. Within days, the barracks smelled of milklessness, infection, and grief. Women buried the dead babies secretly, wrapping them in scraps of cloth, placing them beneath the bunks until they could find a way to dispose of the bodies without drawing attention. The guards eventually discovered the deaths and responded with even greater brutality, turning the barracks upside down, screaming at the mothers, threatening them with punishment for trying to hide the dead. The SS soon created a system to deal with the problem of infants. Mothers and their children were separated. Toddlers were ripped from their mothers' arms. Babies were taken to a designated corner of the camp, a place where they were left to die from starvation. Mothers were forced to watch their children's bodies wither day by day. Some tried to sneak into the infant area at night to feed them. Others begged guards for mercy, offering their own rations. Usually, the guards responded with mockery or violence. The message was clear: children in Ravensbruck were not meant to live. But the cruelty did not end with infants. Older children, those brought to the camp as toddlers or young girls, faced their own horrors. Some were forced into labor alongside adults. Others became targets of abuse simply because they existed. SS women especially seemed to take pleasure in asserting dominance over children, shouting at them during roll call, striking them for the smallest mistakes. One child survivor later recalled that the guards looked at us as if we were insects they wanted to crush. The psychological damage was deep. Children who once sang songs or played games now sat silently, staring at the ground, their childhoods erased within days. For mothers, the emotional agony was relentless. They were forced to choose between impossible options: work hard or be punished, care for their children and risk punishment, give their children food and starve themselves, hope that the child might be spared, or prepare for the certainty of loss. Many women try to shield their children from the worst parts of daily life. They whispered stories into their ears at night, fairy tales, memories of home, promises that this was temporary. Some held their children so tightly that their arms went numb. Others braided their daughter's hair with trembling hands, knowing it might be the last time they felt such simple closeness. Yet even in this darkness, acts of extraordinary courage emerged. Women who had no children of their own took on the role of caretakers. They helped mothers hide infants during inspections. They smuggled crumbs of bread into tiny mouths. They distracted guards when a child cried too loudly. In a place where survival depended on efficiency and obedience, the decision to care for a child was an act of rebellion. One story, often whispered among survivors, tells of a group of Polish political prisoners who formed a secret milk brigade. They stole small amounts of milk from SS kitchens, hiding it in bottles made from hollow potatoes. They risked beatings, torture, even execution, just to keep one or two infants alive for a few more days. These women understood that the babies would likely not survive. But the act of trying became resistance itself, a declaration that the SS could not extinguish their humanity. There were moments when the camp's cruelty toward mothers reached unbearable extremes. During roll call, guards sometimes ordered mothers with sick children to step forward. The women hesitated, terrified. If they obeyed, they risked being selected for punishment. If they refused, their children could be taken. Some guards deliberately tormented mothers by calling out numbers slowly, savoring the terror that spread through the ranks. The smallest sound, a child's cough, a whimper, could lead to violence. When the camp population surged in the early 1940s, overcrowding made life for mothers even more impossible. Women slept in piles, bodies pressed together for warmth, children wedged between them, trying to breathe in spaces too small to move. Lice and fleas covered everyone, but children suffered the most. Their tiny bodies could not withstand the cold, the hunger, the filth. And yet, mothers still tried to protect them, using their own bodies as shields during nighttime inspections or beatings. By 1942, the SS made its stance official. Children were no longer allowed to live in Ravensbruck. Pregnant women were often selected for transports that led to killing sinners. Infants were separated and left to die. Mothers were told nothing. Their pain became another layer of cruelty inside the camp's walls. But pregnancy itself became a dangerous condition. Women who discovered they were pregnant tried desperately to hide it. They wore extra layers when possible, positioned themselves behind others during inspections, avoided drawing attention. Some older women hid pregnant prisoners during roll call, placing them deep in the rows, blocking guards' view. But pregnancies rarely remained hidden for long. When the SS discovered them, the consequences were immediate and brutal. Forced abortions performed without anesthesia, punishments, beatings, and death. The cruelty did not only come from policy. It came from ideology. The Nazi worldview saw motherhood as sacred, but only for Aryan women. Any other mother was considered a threat. If a Jewish woman loved her child fiercely, that emotion was seen as defiance. If a Roma mother cradled her infant, it was seen as a challenge to racial purity. The SS wanted to break these bonds, to demonstrate their absolute control over life and death. Yet, in the very act of trying to destroy motherhood, they revealed its strength. Women found ways to love their children, even when death surrounded them. A mother might braid her daughter's hair in secret. A pregnant woman might whisper to the life growing inside her, even as she feared what would happen when labor came. Mothers held the hands of children who were fading, giving them warmth, comfort, and affection even when there was no chance of survival. These acts were not just gestures. They were resistance. They kept humanity alive in a place designed to annihilate it. There were rare instances, tiny, nearly invisible, when a child survived. A toddler who learned to stay silent. A baby hidden during inspection. A girl protected by older prisoners who pretended she was older and capable of work. These children carried the memories of being held by dozens of women, each one trying to give them a future. They survived not because of the system, but because of the small, stubborn miracles created by women who refused to surrender hope. But for most mothers in Ravensbruck, the story ended in heartbreak. Their children were taken. Their infants starved. Their pregnancies were ended violently. And the grief that followed was a wound that never truly healed. Some women never spoke again after losing their children. Others threw themselves into work, trying to escape their own thoughts. A few chose to join resistance networks inside the camp, fueled by a rage deeper than fear. By the mid-war years, the presence of children grew rare. The SS had tightened their policies. But the memory of those early years, the births, the deaths, the separations, the desperate acts of love, remained carved into the walls of the barracks. Women whispered those stories long after the last child was taken. They whispered them because remembering was the only thing they could still give. And the memory of mothers and children at Ravensbrück was not only a story of cruelty, it was a story of defiance. Even as the SS tried to break them, women found ways to hold on to each other. They learned to mother one another. Younger prisoners called older ones mama. Groups formed surrogate families. Love was shared among strangers who became kin in the darkest place imaginable. But as the camp expanded and the war intensified, Ravensbrück was about to descend into a new realm of horror, one that targeted the body directly, one that would make even the daily suffering of the barracks seem like an earlier, more fragile nightmare. Medical experiments were coming, and the women who survived the loss of their children would soon face a new kind of terror, one that threatened to break not only their spirits, but their very flesh. Chapter 7. The Rabbits. Medical Experiments on Polish Women. It began with a list, a simple sheet of paper carried into the barracks one cold evening, held by an SS woman whose expression revealed nothing. No sympathy, no hesitation, no trace of the human feeling she might once have had before the uniform reshaped her. She read out numbers, not names, her voice flat, each number cutting through the silence like a blade. The women stiffened. They knew that any selection meant danger, but this selection felt different. The guards' eyes lingered too long. The dogs paced with unusual restlessness. And the women called forward, all young, all Polish, all political prisoners, felt a wave of dread move through them more powerful than anything they had faced before. These were the women who would become known as the Rabbits, a name whispered in the darkest corners of Ravensbrück, a word that carried terror for some and defiant pride for others. It was the mocking nickname the SS used for them, comparing them to laboratory animals. But among the prisoners, the name transformed. It became a symbol of resilience, of impossible courage in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The first group was taken from the barracks after roll call, marched across the gravel toward the camp infirmary, a place that hardly deserved the name. The building had the smell of disinfectant mixed with blood, a cold, metallic scent that clung to everything inside. The women's footsteps echoed in the corridor, each step punctuated by the nervous breath of the one beside them. They looked at each other with wide eyes, trying to understand what was happening. Some prayed silently. Others clenched their fists. None could have imagined what awaited them. Inside the examination room, SS doctors stood in white coats, their faces expressionless. Among them was Karl Gebhardt, the personal physician to Himmler, a man who had convinced himself that experimenting on prisoners was scientifically necessary. He believed he was testing sulfonamide treatments for battlefield infections, preparing to save German soldiers. But the truth was far more sinister. The experiments were not medical research. They were torture disguised as science. The doctors selected limbs at random. A woman's right leg, another's left. Then the doors closed, and the first incisions were made. They began with deliberate infection. Cuts were carved deep into the women's legs, ugly wounds designed to mimic battlefield injuries. Dirt, glass, and bacteria were rubbed into the gashes. In some cases, the doctors ground rusted nails into the wounds while the women screamed, their voices bouncing off the sterile tiles. The infection spread quickly, swelling the legs, turning the skin purple and black. The pain was indescribable. Some women later said it felt like fire beneath their flesh, a burning that traveled through their veins. But the infections were only the beginning. The doctors wanted to test the effects of sulfonamide drugs, so half of the women received the medication. The other half received nothing, not even bandages. They were left in their beds, writhing, feverish, crying out as the infection consumed their muscles. Some begged for death. Some slipped into delirium. Some bit their own lips until blood dripped onto the floor. The SS nurses, women trained to care for life in the outside world, became executioners inside this building. They tightened straps around arms and legs. They held down women who thrashed in agony. They shushed them when their screams disturbed the doctor's concentration. The prisoners could not fathom how someone could look into their eyes during such torture and remain unmoved. Many survivors later said that the coldness of the SS nurses haunted them more than the experiments themselves. When the infection experiments failed to produce the results the SS wanted, the doctors escalated. They moved on to bone experiments. Women were dragged from their beds and forced onto operating tables. No anesthesia, no painkillers, nothing to dull the sensation of bone being cut, broken, or removed. The doctors sliced into legs and carved out pieces of bone. They implanted foreign materials, glass, wood, metal, bacteria-soaked splinters, to observe how the body reacted. They severed nerves. They removed entire muscle sections. They shattered bones deliberately, then set them incorrectly, watching to see whether the women would heal or die. The screams from these procedures echoed across the infirmary, bleeding into the gravel yard outside. Some prisoners tried to block their ears. Others whispered prayers, their voices shaking. And some simply sat motionless, staring into the distance, because they knew that they might be next. The Polish women chosen for these experiments were mostly young, students, teachers, members of the resistance. Their youth was not accidental. The doctors wanted healthy subjects whose bodies could survive extreme trauma. These women had fought against Nazi occupation, smuggling messages, hiding weapons, participating in underground networks. Now they found themselves trapped in a nightmare where every act of defiance had become a reason for their suffering. But even here, even in this place of medical horror, resistance grew. At first, the prisoners did not know how many were being experimented on. Women returned to the barracks unable to walk, their legs swollen, stitched scarred. Some hid their wounds, terrified that showing weakness would lead to further selection. They hobbled to roll call, leaning on each other, gritting their teeth. But eventually, the abnormalities became too obvious to hide. The barracks learned the truth, and the prisoners banded together to protect the women who had become targets. They created hiding places inside the barracks, false bunks built against walls, loose boards beneath the floor. When the SS came searching for more subjects, the women smuggled the rabbits into these hiding spots. They risked severe punishment, even execution, but they refused to surrender one another. When a guard noticed someone missing, the prisoners stalled, sang loudly to cover whispers, shifted their bodies to block the SS line of sight. The resistance became a network. Messages were smuggled between barracks. Lists were kept of every woman experimented on. Names, numbers, injuries, all written in tiny script, hidden inside clothing, carried by women who moved between work sites. These records would become vital after the war, but at the time, they were insurance for survival. The prisoners believed that if the outside world learned what was happening, someone might intervene. It was a fragile hope, but it kept them alive. The experiments continued in 1942, 1943, and beyond. The doctors grew more reckless. They operated on women multiple times, reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. They changed their methods, testing different chemicals, cutting deeper, breaking more bones. The women's bodies became battlegrounds of cruelty. Yet the rabbits refused to break. They created rituals to keep their spirits alive. They sang softly in the barracks, humming Polish hymns. They supported each other physically, carrying one another to roll call, lifting women whose legs could no longer bear weight. When one was too weak to move, others formed a protective shield around her, hiding her from the eyes of the guards. One German political prisoner, who had not been selected for experiments, took it upon herself to clean the wounds of the rabbits every night. She tore pieces of her own clothing to make bandages. She carried water in secret. She whispered reassurances in the dim light, tears in her eyes as she saw the extent of the injuries. When the SS nurses discovered her helping, they beat her brutally. She returned the next night anyway. For every act of cruelty by the SS, there was a corresponding act of defiance by the prisoners. But the price was high. When the doctors realized that women were hiding the rabbits, they threatened collective punishment. Entire barracks were forced to stand outside in the cold for hours. Food rations were cut. Work details became harsher. The guards beat women for minor infractions, making clear that resistance would not be tolerated. But the prisoners did not stop. The rabbits became symbols of courage for the entire camp, symbols of what the SS feared most: unity. By 1944, as Germany began losing the war, the SS panicked. They knew the experiments violated every international law. They knew Allied forces were closing in. They began destroying records, burning documents, and preparing to eliminate witnesses. The rabbits were suddenly in grave danger. Their continued existence threatened to expose the truth. A list was drawn up. The SS planned to execute them all. The prisoners learned of this plan through whispers carried across the camp. Panic surged. The rabbits, limping, scarred, many unable to walk without help, were hidden again. This time, every woman in the barracks became part of the effort. They moved bunks together to conceal narrow spaces. They built false floors. They hid women inside piles of straw. They took turns standing guard while SS patrols searched for missing numbers. The guards became suspicious. They increased inspections. They pulled women from bunks, dragged them outside, beat them until blood spattered the ground. But the rabbits stayed hidden. Then, in a chilling escalation, the SS announced that the next transport leaving Ravensbruck would contain all Polish political prisoners under the age of 30. The prisoners recognized the trap. This was not a transport to another camp. This was a death list. On the day of the selection, the rabbits refused to leave the barracks. They held hands, forming a chain of bodies weakened by surgeries and infections. It was a moment of pure refusal, fragile, trembling, but absolute. They would not walk willingly to their deaths. What happened next was extraordinary. The entire barrack stood behind them. Women of every nationality, every background, every political affiliation filled the doorway, blocking the guards. They refused to move. They refused to give the SS a single woman. The guards shouted. They threatened executions. Dogs lunged at the line. Rifles were raised. But the women did not break. A showdown unfolded. Hundreds of prisoners facing a handful of guards. A silent battle of wills. And for reasons that may never be fully understood, perhaps confusion, perhaps a rare moment of hesitation, perhaps the realization that violence might spark riot, the SS backed down. The women were not taken that day. But the danger did not pass. As the war neared its end, the SS intensified its efforts to eliminate witnesses. The rabbits were moved to another barrack, then another. Each relocation brought new terror. The guards searched with increasing aggression. Women were dragged from bunks and interrogated. Some were shot. Some disappeared. Yet, remarkably, many of the rabbits survived to liberation. When Soviet troops entered Ravensbruck in April 1945, they found women whose legs were covered in scars that looked like maps of pain. Deep ridges, uneven bone, missing muscle, wounds reopened and closed again. They found women who could barely stand, but who had held on to life with a fierceness that defied everything the SS had done to them. These women later testified at the Nuremberg trials. They showed their scars. They told their stories. Their courage helped convict some of the very doctors and nurses who had tortured them. And their voices became symbols not only of suffering, but of resistance, solidarity, and strength. But at Ravensbruck, while the rabbits fought to survive the experiments, the camp itself was shifting into an even darker phase. The arrival of Jewish women, the expansion of forced labor, the construction of the camp's own gas chamber. These looming horrors waited just beyond the infirmary walls. And as the SS tightened its grip, Ravensbruck transformed from a place of terror into a place of industrialized murder. The next chapter would reveal suffering on a scale even the early prisoners could not have imagined. Chapter 8: Sterilization, Reproductive Abuse, and Experiments on Women. It began with rumors whispered in the barracks, rumors that traveled from bed to bed in the darkness, carried on trembling breaths. Women spoke of strange procedures happening in the infirmary, of screams muffled by walls, of prisoners returning with blank eyes and wounds they would not describe. At first, nobody knew what these rumors meant. Ravensbruck was already a place built on cruelty, starvation, beatings, disease, forced labor, medical experiments. But this whispered terror felt even more intimate, more violating. The rumors spoke of something the SS wanted to destroy at its core: the ability of women to create life. For the Nazis, reproduction was not simply a biological function. It was a weapon of ideology. They believed in controlling who could bear children and who could not. Aryan women were encouraged, pressured, praised, rewarded to have as many babies as possible for the Reich. But the women imprisoned at Ravensbruck, political dissidents, Jews, Roma, so-called asocials, lesbians, prisoners of war, the disabled, were considered enemies of the racial order. To allow these women to reproduce was, in the Nazi mind, a threat. Their bodies, their fertility, their very ability to create families had to be policed, controlled, extinguished. This belief became flesh inside Ravensbruck. It began quietly. Doctors arrived wearing clean white coats, carrying metal instruments that glinted under the dim infirmary lights. They walked past the sick beds, past the injured rabbits, past the coughing women in the infectious disease ward. They stopped instead of the healthy ones, the strong, the young, the ones who could work. The doctors did not choose randomly. They selected women whose bodies the SS believed could survive invasive procedures. That was the irony. The healthier the prisoner, the more likely she was to be targeted. Women were summoned by number. They were told nothing. They lined up outside the infirmary, pressed together for warmth, trying to hide their fear. Some prayed. Some clenched their fists. Some tried to remember the faces of their children, wondering if this might be the last time they thought of them. Inside, they were ordered to undress. The cold hit their bare skin like a slap. Metal instruments lay on tables. Needles, blades, clamps, scissors, all arranged neatly like tools waiting for a mechanic. The doctor spoke clinically, their words empty of emotion. They did not see women. They saw bodies, specimens. The first procedures were simple examinations, or so the doctors claimed. Pelvic exams without explanation. Probing, measuring, cutting. Women cried out. Some fainted. The SS nurses held them down. But these exams were only the beginning. The real purpose soon became horribly clear. The SS wanted to sterilize them. Sterilization, ending a woman's ability to bear children, had already been used widely in Nazi Germany against disabled people and those deemed genetically unfit. But Ravensbruck marked a new chapter in this assault, one carried out on healthy women whose only crime was being ideologically or racially undesirable. The first method was surgical. Doctors cut into the women's abdomens, removing ovaries, slicing fallopian tubes, performing hysterectomies, all without anesthesia or with only the weakest sedatives. Women awoke during the procedure, screaming, vomiting, thrashing. Nurses gagged them. Guards struck them. The operations left deep scars, infections, permanent pain. Some women died within hours. Others lingered, feverish, delirious, whispering for help that never came. Then came the chemical methods. Doctors injected caustic substances directly into the uterus: silver nitrate, iodine solutions, acids, designed to burn the reproductive organs from the inside. Women described the pain as a fire that consumed their entire bodies. Some collapsed, convulsing. Others bled for days, trembling as infection spread. Many could never walk normally again. These injections were unpredictable. Some sterilized instantly, while others left women with lifelong bleeding, tumors, or agonizing cramps. And yet the SS continued, forcing women to return again and again for more injections, as if they were testing how much a human body could endure before it failed completely. But the most infamous method was X-ray sterilization. The women were lined up in a bare room, ordered to lie beneath a machine that hummed ominously. They were told nothing, but they could sense danger in the air. The machine was positioned between their legs. A blinding heat pulsed against their skin. Some women tried to move. Guards forced them still. Minutes passed. Long, slow, unbearable minutes. When the women were finally allowed to leave, they felt something was wrong. Their skin burned. Their stomachs cramped. Their hair fell out. Their menstrual cycles stopped. Some developed internal bleeding that lasted for weeks. Some collapsed in the barracks the same night, shaking violently until death took them. Doctors watched all of this silently, recording the results in neat handwriting. The goal was not care. The goal was control. Pregnancy inside Ravensbruck became a death sentence. At first, some pregnant women were allowed to give birth. But as the camp grew and Nazi policy hardened, pregnancy became forbidden. The SS viewed pregnant prisoners as unproductive, useless, permanently unfit for work. They did not care how conception happened, rape by guards, relationships formed in earlier prisons, or marriages before arrest. To them, a pregnant prisoner was an obstacle. So the SS ordered abortions. Guards marched pregnant women to the infirmary. Some women tried to hide their bellies, wrapping cloth around themselves, hunching their shoulders, standing behind others during roll call. But eventually, the swelling could not be hidden. The abortions were conducted in the most brutal conditions imaginable. No anesthesia, no sterilization. Metal tools used again and again without cleaning. Women screamed until their voices broke. They bled onto the floor. Some were kicked for making too much noise. Many did not survive. Those who did were often left infertile, their bodies unable to heal from the trauma inflicted upon them. Even births that were allowed to happen ended in tragedy. A baby born in Ravensbruck had almost no chance of survival. There was no milk, no diapers, no warmth, no medicine. Newborns starved within days. Mothers held them to their chests, trying desperately to keep them alive, whispering lullabies through tears. Some women shared their bread, risking their own lives to keep an infant alive a little longer. But starvation is relentless and cruel. Babies wasted away, their cries fading into silence. The SS took these tiny bodies away without ceremony. Some mothers never learned what was done with their infants. They lived with an emptiness that never healed. The psychological torment was profound. Women lost not only their fertility, but their sense of self. Many had grown up believing their worth was tied to motherhood, an idea reinforced by every society across Europe. To have that ability stolen by force was not just a physical injury. It was a tearing apart of identity, a destruction of dreams, a mutilation of hope. Some women sank into deep despair. Others tried to kill themselves. A few harmed themselves deliberately to avoid further experiments. But many, through unimaginable courage, made the choice to cling to life. Even in this hell, resistance emerged. The clandestine network that formed earlier to protect the rabbits now expanded to defend pregnant women and those targeted for sterilization. Older prisoners hid younger ones beneath blankets during searches. Nurses who were prisoners smuggled small amounts of sterile water or cloth. Women stood in front of others during roll call to block guards' view of swollen bellies. Rumors about sterilization methods spread quickly. Women learned to avoid the infirmary unless absolutely necessary. Some inflicted mild injuries on themselves, cuts, burns, swollen limbs, so the SS would view them as unfit for testing. Others memorized the shifting patterns of guards, slipping away moments before being seized. There were acts of astonishing bravery. A Polish prisoner once grabbed a syringe of sterilizing solution from a nurse and flung it out a window before being beaten unconscious. A group of French women refused an order to strip when they suspected an inspection was masking a sterilization selection. They were whipped but stood their ground. In one extraordinary instance, prisoners created a decoy belly out of rags to make guards believe one woman was already pregnant, buying time for another whose pregnancy was further advanced. But despite resistance, Countless women suffered irreversible damage. Some never menstruated again. Some lived with infections that lasted the rest of their lives. Some carried pain in their hips, their backs, their stomachs, pain that reminded them every day of what had been stolen. And yet, decades later, many testified. Their voices trembled but did not break. Their words became evidence, truth, memory. Not all the perpetrators escaped justice. Gebhardt was tried and executed at Nuremberg. Some SS nurses who assisted in sterilizations stood trial in Germany and Poland. But many others disappeared into post-war life. They married. They had children. They worked ordinary jobs. They never spoke of what they did in Ravensbrück, what they saw, what they destroyed. For the survivors, the scars never faded. Some married after the war and lived with the pain of infertility. Others adopted children or raised nieces and nephews as their own. Some carried guilt for surviving when their unborn children did not. Others refused to let the Nazis take motherhood from them and bore children anyway, despite the physical risks. They lived. They continued. They rebuilt. But their memories of Ravensbrück did not fade. The cold metal instruments, the way a doctor looked at them without seeing a person, the shame, the fear, the helplessness, the courage of the women who held their hands, the whispered cries in the night, the knowledge that the camp had tried to end the possibility of future life and failed. Because although the Nazis scarred these women's bodies, they could not extinguish their capacity to love, to nurture, to resist. The bonds they forged in the barracks became lifelines. The care they offered one another under the threat of death became a testament stronger than any ideology. But as the war intensified, Ravensbrück's cruelty deepened. Sterilization was only one instrument of repression. A new wave of prisoners, thousands of Jewish women from across Europe, was about to flood the camp. The barracks would overflow. Food would vanish. Disease would surge. And the SS, desperate to maintain control, would escalate their brutality to levels the women had not yet seen. The gas chamber was coming, and with it, Ravensbrück would descend into a chapter of horror so vast, so industrial, so relentless, that even the survivors struggled to find words for what followed. Chapter 9: Forced Labor, Siemens, Textile Factories, and the War Machine. It began with the rumble of trucks at dawn, engines coughing in the cold as guards shouted for the women to form lines. By 1942, Ravensbrück was no longer simply a concentration camp. It had become a reservoir of human labor, an engine built to feed the Nazi war machine with the last strength squeeze from starving bodies. Every woman who could stand was pulled into this system, and every woman who faltered risked being replaced, discarded, or sent to her death. The SS needed workers, and the German industrial giants needed cheap, compliant, expendable hands. Ravensbrück became the answer. The camp's transformation into a labor complex was not sudden. It crept into daily life like a shadow growing longer each month. At first, prisoners simply maintained the camp, digging trenches, hauling wood, repairing buildings. But as the war expanded and German factories strained to keep up with military demands, the SS recognized the economic potential of the women they held captive. The camp commandant received new orders. Ravensbrück must be reorganized into a center for massive slave labor production, capable of supporting industries vital to the war: textiles, munitions, electrical components, aircraft parts, and more. The first major partnership came with Siemens, one of Germany's largest electrical and engineering corporations. Siemens wanted a steady supply of workers to assemble switches, relays, precision instruments, and components for military communications. They built a factory directly next to the camp, just beyond the fence, so the women could be marched their daily underguard. When the prisoners saw the building for the first time, they were shocked by its size. Long concrete halls, high windows, rows of machines waiting for operators. It looked almost modern compared to the decaying barracks. But the women quickly learned that there was nothing modern about the suffering that unfolded inside. Each morning, before dawn, guards marched hundreds of women through the gate, dogs snarling at their heels. They trudged across the gravel yard, shivering, thin dresses clinging to their bodies in the cold. Inside the factory, the air was warmer, the lighting harsh, the noise overwhelming. A constant clatter of metal, the whir of machines, the snap of electrical sparks. The women were assigned to long rows of workstations, each one equipped with tools they had never seen before. They received no training. They were expected to learn instantly or be punished. Mistakes were inevitable. Fingers shook from hunger. Vision blurred from exhaustion. Women dropped parts, misaligned screws, connected wires incorrectly. Guards struck them for being too slow or clumsy. Seamen supervisors monitored the room, their faces set in hard, industrial efficiency. They cared nothing for the women, only for production numbers. The shifts lasted 12, sometimes 14 hours. There were no breaks except for a thin bowl of soup consumed standing, hands trembling. Some women fainted. Others collapsed at their stations, unable to summon the strength to continue. If they fell, guards dragged them aside with contempt, beating them until they stood again or until their bodies refused to respond. But Siemens was only one of many. Textile factories sprouted around the camp like poisonous mushrooms. Women were put to work sewing uniforms for the Wehrmacht, stitching boots, weaving fabric for military tents, repairing torn clothing for battlefields. The textile workshops were cramped, dusty, suffocating. The air choked with fibers that clogged the lungs. Women coughed constantly, their throats raw. Their fingers bled from needles. Some lost the use of their hands entirely from repetitive strain. The SS had found a perfect formula. Women who cost nothing, who asked for nothing, who had no rights, who could be worked until they dropped, and replaced the moment they could no longer keep pace. Worse still, the camp opened dozens of subcamps, small forced labor satellites attached to factories, armaments plants, and mines across Germany. Ravensbruck became the central hub, sending thousands of women to these outposts. The subcamps were even more brutal than Ravensbrück itself. Some lacked proper shelters. Others forced women to work night and day, digging anti-tank ditches, building roads, cleaning bomb debris. These subcamps swallowed women whole. Many never returned. Inside Ravensbrück, the labor assignments reflected a cruel hierarchy. Women deemed strong were sent to the Siemens factory. Others were forced into grueling construction tasks, hauling stone, mixing cement, building new barracks. Old women, sick women, and those recovering from medical experiments were often forced into textile work that shredded their lungs or domestic labor for SS families, cleaning homes, washing uniforms, cooking for officers. There was no reprieve. Even illness did not guarantee rest. A woman could be coughing blood and still be ordered to report for work. Refusal meant punishment, whipping, starvation in the bunker, or execution. The SS measured a woman's value by the amount of labor she could produce. A prisoner who produced less than expected was labeled Arbeitsschuh, work shy, a mark that often led to death. Labor became not only a tool of exploitation, but a tool of extermination. The women knew this. They could feel in their bones as they dragged themselves from their bunks each morning, muscles aching, joints swollen from cold, stomachs burning with hunger. They whispered to each other, "Work is killing us." And yet they worked, because the alternative was worse. Still, in this brutal machinery, traces of humanity and resistance flickered. Inside the Siemens factory, women began to sabotage production. Subtle acts at first: loose wires, faulty connections, weakened components. The kind of sabotage that would go unnoticed until the device failed on the battlefield. They risked their lives with every misaligned screw, every deliberately flawed part. If caught, they knew they could be shot. But they sabotaged anyway. In the textile workshops, women purposely misstitched seams on uniforms. They used weaker thread, knowing it would unravel. They allowed mistakes to slip through, creating tiny fractures in the Nazi war effort. These acts were small, almost invisible, but they were acts of resistance, acts of courage, acts that gave meaning to lives stripped of everything else. Other forms of resistance emerged as well. Women stole scraps of cloth from the textile factory and fashioned makeshift bandages. They smuggled bits of thread, needles, and fabric back to the barracks, using them to mend the torn clothes of the sick. In the seamen's plant, they hid tiny metal pieces under their tongues or in their shoes, carrying them back to the camp to use as tools. Prisoners created survival networks. They exchanged information about which jobs were slightly safer. They warned each other about the most sadistic supervisors. They hid the weak during selections, forming human shields to protect them. But even resistance carried its own despair. Women feared that sabotage might be discovered, and punishment would fall not only on the guilty, but on the entire work detail. They lived in constant uncertainty, navigating a world where every choice held danger. And yet, something unexpected happened inside the factories. The women, despite the exhaustion, despite the beatings, despite the hunger, became experts at their tasks. They learned to assemble electrical components with precision. They mastered the operation of sewing machines. They memorized production processes faster than the supervisors expected. This was not because they wanted to serve the Reich. It was because survival demanded it. A woman who worked efficiently avoided beatings. A woman who demonstrated skill sometimes received slightly less brutal supervisors. Work became a cruel negotiation, skill exchanged for a tiny margin of safety. Still, the work took its toll. The long hours, the lack of sleep, the starvation. Women began collapsing in greater numbers. Some died at their workstations, falling face first into machinery or onto the cold factory floor. The guards stepped over their bodies. The machines did not stop. The SS monitored production numbers obsessively. When output dropped, punishments increased. Women were forced to stand outside in the cold after long shifts. Food rations were reduced. Brutality escalated. By 1943, the factories had become the center of Ravensbruck's identity. The camp was no longer simply a detention site. It was an industrial machine designed to convert women into tools. And yet, the women were not passive tools. In one of the most remarkable stories of defiance, a group of French women working in a textile factory managed to hide coded messages inside the seams of German military uniforms. Messages addressed to the Allies, warnings about the conditions in the camp. They stitched these messages with such skill that the SS never found them. Some of these uniforms made their way to Allied soldiers, who discovered the notes months later. Inside the factories, women protected each other. When one grew weak, others took over her tasks. When a supervisor approached, they covered mistakes. When someone fainted, they caught her before she hit the ground. These were small acts, but they were everything. Forced labor also created strange and painful tensions. Women who worked inside factories sometimes received slightly larger food rations. Those who remained in the camp doing construction or cleaning work received less. Hunger created jealousy. Exhaustion created anger. The SS used this to their advantage, trying to divide the women. But the women resisted that division too. By 1944, the war was turning against Germany. Allied bombings shook the subcamps. Factories suffered shortages. Production slowed. The SS increased pressure on Ravensbrück, demanding more workers, more output, more sacrifice. The camp population exploded. Women were crammed into barracks so tightly that they slept sitting up. Disease spread like wildfire. The SS responded by sending the weakest women to be killed. The labor system and the extermination system had become one. Women who could no longer work were selected during roll call, marched to the infirmary, injected with poison, or shot. Later, they would be sent to the camp's own gas chamber. The factories continued to operate even as Ravensbrück descended into chaos. The machines hummed. The sewing needles clattered. The guard shouted. The women worked. And death hovered over everything like a shadow that would not lift. Thousands died from exhaustion, from starvation, from disease intensified by forced labor. They died with tools in their hands, fabric beneath their fingers, metal parts scattered around their feet. Yet, within this mechanized hell, humanity clung on. Women whispered encouragement to each other. They shared crumbs. They told stories about their children. They hummed songs from home, Polish lullabies, French folk songs, Russian hymns. They carved tiny symbols into scraps of wood, crosses, hearts, initials, as reminders that they were more than numbers. Some women, weakened beyond measure, still managed to whisper, "We will survive. We must." But survival became harder with each passing month. The SS demanded more and more labor from bodies that had nothing left to give. And the war was reaching its climax. The factories would soon face bombings, shortages, and total collapse. And Ravensbrück, overcrowded, collapsing, boiling with disease, would become even more deadly. For the women trapped inside, a new horror was approaching. The influx of Jewish transports, the camp's transformation into a killing center, and the construction of a gas chamber that would claim thousands of lives. Forced labor had already taken so much. Their strength, their health, their dignity. But the next chapter would take something even more sacred. It would take their lives. Chapter 10. The expansion, subcamps, overcrowding, and the arrival of Jewish transports. It began with the sound of wheels, train wheels grinding against steel in the distance, echoing through the forest like a warning. Women in Ravensbruck heard it first as a faint vibration beneath their feet, a tremor that rippled through the gravel yard during roll call. Then the rumble grew louder. More trains, more trucks, more transports. By 1943, the camp was swelling far beyond anything its designers had imagined. What had once held a few thousand prisoners now held tens of thousands. Barracks overflowed. Food dwindled. Disease stalked the camp. And the arrival of Jewish transports marked a shift so profound that even the hardest women in the camp felt a new terror settle over them. The camp was no longer a single entity. It was becoming a vast web of suffering. 40, then 50, then 60 satellite subcamps stretching across Germany and occupied Europe. Each subcamp was tied to a factory, a mine, a construction site, a military depot. Prisoners were shipped out like cargo and replaced constantly, feeding a system that consumed women like fuel. Ravensbruck became the central hub, the mother camp, the beating heart of a machine that ran on starvation, fear, and relentless labor. But inside the main camp itself, conditions had reached a breaking point. The barracks, originally built to house 200 women, now held 600, 800, even 1,000 at a time. Women slept in shifts. Some stood all night because there was no space on the bunks. Others slept on the cold floor, pressed against strangers, their breath forming a humid cloud that thickened the air. The wooden walls dripped with condensation. Lice swarmed. Bedbugs crawled freely. The smell of sweat, infection, excrement, and rotting straw clung to every surface. Every day, new transports arrived with more women, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian, French, Dutch, German, Roma, and then, increasingly, Jewish women. The Jewish transports changed everything. Before these transports, the camp had already been brutal, now became lethal. Women who had survived years of imprisonment sensed immediately that these newcomers were in greater danger than anyone who had come before. The guards treated them with a level of contempt that surpassed even their usual cruelty. Jewish women were shoved, beaten, stripped of dignity the moment they stepped off the trucks. Some arrived wearing star badges. Others had their badges ripped off during transport. All arrived with fear in their eyes. Fear rooted not only in what they saw, but in what they already knew. They had heard of Auschwitz. They had heard of Treblinka. They had heard whispers of gas chambers, mass graves, entire families disappearing without a trace. When they entered Ravensbruck, they carried this knowledge inside them, a weight heavier than the bags they were forced to abandon at the gate. The camp could not contain them. There was no space left. Women were shoved into barracks, so crowded that some slept standing up against the walls, leaning on one another to keep from collapsing. Guards pushed more women inside until the air itself felt solid, thick, impossible to breathe. The arrival of Jewish transports also brought new layers of fear to the camp. The SS viewed Jewish prisoners as the lowest category, the ones most easily disposed of. They were assigned the hardest work details, the least food, the harshest punishments. They were targeted during selections, the process through which the SS chose who would live another day and who would be sent to die. The Jewish women sensed this immediately. Some fainted during roll call. Others stared at the ground, trying to hide their terror. At night, the barracks filled with whispers. "They will kill us first," some women murmured. "They will take us away," others replied. The older prisoners, those who had survived earlier phases of the camp, tried to comfort them. They shared what little food they had. They explained the routines. They taught them how to stand during roll call without fainting. These acts of kindness were gestures of defiance in a place designed to destroy compassion. But even kindness could not stop what was coming. By this time, the camp's infrastructure was crumbling under the weight of overcrowding. The latrines overflowed. The infirmary had no space. Women sick with typhus lay beside women suffering from frostbite, pneumonia, dysentery, untreated infections. The smell of disease became constant, a sour, heavy stench that clung to the skin and filled the lungs. The SS responded as they always did, with violence. When a camp grew too crowded, they tightened control. Roll calls grew longer. Punishments became more severe. Women were forced to stand for hours in freezing rain while guards counted and recounted them, taking perverse pleasure in watching them collapse. Those who fell were beaten. Those who could not stand were dragged away. The guards walked along the lines with dogs straining at their leashes, teeth bared, waiting for the slightest movement to justify an attack. Inside the barracks, selections began. A guard would enter with a clipboard, followed by an SS doctor with cold, assessing eyes. They walked between bunks, evaluating women with terrifying efficiency. They touched faces, lifted chins, inspected legs for swelling, signs of weakness, signs of exhaustion. A nod meant survival. A frown meant death. Jewish women were often selected first. The prisoners learned to fear the sound of the doctor's boots more than anything else. Women tried to appear strong, standing straight, even when their bones ached. They pinched their cheeks to bring color to their skin. They tied their hair tightly to hide how much it had fallen out. They supported each other by locking arms, one woman helping another stay upright, even when her legs could no longer bear weight. But the doctor saw everything, and when he pointed to a woman, she knew it was over. She would be removed from the barrack, taken to the infirmary, or marched toward the trucks, or, later, toward the new building the women whispered about at night. A building with a chimney. A building the guards avoided talking about. A building some women said they had seen men working on at night, their shadows flickering in the glow of construction lamps. But even before the gas chamber was built, Ravensbruck became a place of quiet extermination. Women died in their bunks, their bodies curled into themselves like withered leaves. Others died standing during roll call. Some died in the factories, fainting into machinery that crushed them. Many died from starvation, their stomachs swollen, their eyes hollow, their limbs skeletal. Death became as common as breathing. The SS did not care. They simply replaced them with new prisoners. And the transports kept coming. Dutch Jews, French Jews, Hungarian Jews, Polish Jews, Czech Jews, German Jews, mothers with daughters, sisters holding hands. Women who once lived ordinary lives filled with family dinners, music lessons, school days, weddings. Women who now stepped off trucks into a world designed to grind them into dust. Some arrived after surviving ghettos or death marches. Their bodies were so fragile that a single step onto the gravel made them wince. They carried trauma in their eyes, lost too deep to express, memories of families torn apart, communities destroyed, cities emptied. These women brought stories with them, stories that spread through Ravensbruck like wildfire. Stories of mass shootings, stories of deportations, stories of gas chambers at Auschwitz-Birkenau, stories of entire transports vanishing into smoke. The women who had been in Ravensbruck longest listened in horror. They had known cruelty. They had known brutality. But this was organized, industrial murder on a scale they had not imagined. The camp shifted. Fear deepened. Hope withered. Yet even in this moment of despair, The women resisted the destruction of their identities. Jewish prisoners formed small groups to protect each other. They shared food, arranged themselves in the barracks so the weakest could be sheltered in the center. They whispered prayers at night, sang fragments of Hebrew songs, recited memories of holidays and traditions. They held on to whatever pieces of themselves remained. One night, during a roll call that stretched on for hours, a Jewish woman from Poland fainted. The guard moved toward her, raising his arm to strike. But before he could, another woman stepped forward, German, political, not Jewish, and stood between them. The guard snarled, struck them both, but the moment mattered. In that instant, barriers of language, nationality, and faith dissolved. They were women together in a nightmare that did not distinguish between them when it came to cruelty. As more transports arrived, the SS began planning expansions. New barracks were built hastily, without care. The walls were thin. The floors splintered. Roofs leaked. These new structures were not meant for living. They were meant for containment, temporary holding pens until the prisoners could be worked to death or selected for extermination. At the same time, the subcamps grew. Ravensbruck women were shipped to work in aircraft factories, munitions plants, coal mines, and underground bunkers. These subcamps were unspeakably brutal. Cold, underfed, filthy, dangerous. Women were crushed under falling rocks, burned by chemicals, killed in industrial accidents, shot by guards when they collapsed. They died alone, far from the main camp, their names and numbers lost in the chaos of war. But inside Ravensbruck, a strange and powerful thing happened. The more crowded the camp became, the more connected the women became. The cramped barracks forced them closer, physically and emotionally. They learned each other's languages. They shared stories from every corner of Europe. They prayed together. They taught each other songs. They translated news from new arrivals. They warned each other about dangerous guards. They risked their lives to save one another from selections. Out of overcrowding grew solidarity. Out of despair grew defiance. Out of brutality grew courage. But even courage could not stop what was coming. The war was reaching its climax. The Nazis were losing. The front lines were collapsing. Panic seeped into the camp leadership. The SS began tightening its control with desperation. Food rations dropped to almost nothing. Punishments intensified. The air grew sharper with fear. And then, in the heart of Ravensbruck, construction quietly began on a new structure, a structure that would forever change the camp's fate. The gas chamber. Whispers of its existence spread through the barracks like a deadly wind. What are they building? Why are they adding chimneys? What will they do with us? The women sensed an ending approaching, a terrible ending. Because Ravensbruck was no longer just a place of forced labor or medical experiments or slow starvation. It was becoming a place of systematic death. And the next chapter would reveal the true horror of what the SS planned for the thousands of women who were now trapped behind the camp's electrified fences. Chapter 11: Torture, Punishment, and the Brutality of SS Guards. It began with footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing across the gravel in the early morning darkness. The women in Ravensbruck knew the sound well. It was the sound that decided their fate every day. The rhythm of boots approaching could mean anything: a routine inspection, a sudden punishment, a beating, a selection, or a cruelty no one could predict. The SS guards, especially the women, embraced unpredictability as a weapon. And in Ravensbruck, punishments were not simply acts of discipline. They were performances of power, demonstrations meant to terrify, to divide, to crush the spirit long before the body gave out. The brutality had existed from the camp's earliest days, but as Ravensbruck grew, as overcrowding increased, as Jewish transports arrived, and as the war turned against Germany, the violence intensified. The guards grew harsher, their tempers shorter, their punishments more creative and more cruel. Many arrived at the camp as ordinary young women, recruited from small towns and offered steady pay, housing, and authority. But the uniform changed them. The camp changed them. Or perhaps the uniform allowed something already inside them to flourish. Every prisoner learned quickly that there was no safe moment. Roll call, work detail, inspections, mealtime, even sleep. At any hour, without reason, a guard might explode into violence. For some guards, cruelty was a duty. For others, it was entertainment. One of the first lessons the prisoners learned was that punishment did not always require wrongdoing. A crooked seam on a uniform, a delayed response, a shoe that looked too worn, eyes that appeared too tired. These could lead to blows with a baton, kicks to the ribs, fists to the face. The guards' cruelty was fueled not only by ideology, but by boredom, frustration, and a desire to assert dominance in a place where prisoners had no voice. The beating block, known in whispers as the horse, became one of the most feared objects in the camp. It was a simple wooden structure, worn smooth where countless bodies had been thrown over it. Women were ordered to bend forward, their hands tied or held down by guards, while another guard whipped them with belts, sticks, or wires. Sometimes they received 10 lashes, sometimes 20, sometimes more. There was no limit. Women screamed until their voices broke. Some fainted. Some bled through their clothing. The guards watched their suffering with cold curiosity, adjusting their strikes to cause maximum pain without killing the victim, at least not immediately. Dorothea Binns, one of the most notorious guards, often supervised these punishments. She walked up and down the line of prisoners, her boots clicking sharply against the wooden floors, her eyes scanning for signs of defiance or weakness. If a woman cried too loudly, she ordered more lashes. If a woman remained silent, she punished her for insolence. Binns believed suffering was weakness, and weakness deserved destruction. Prisoners later recalled that she would sometimes smile as she watched them writhe in agony. But not all punishments required physical tools. Some required only time and cold. The standing cell, tiny, lightless, airless, was another punishment reserved for those who displeased the guards. Women were forced into these narrow cupboards where they could not sit or lie down. Hours passed, then days. The air grew thick. Limbs shook uncontrollably. The body screamed for rest. Prisoners emerged barely able to stand, often vomiting, their legs swollen, their minds clouded with hallucinations. Some never recovered. Some died inside those cells, their bodies slumped against the walls. And yet, the guards continued to invent new torture methods, each one designed to attack the body and mind simultaneously. One of the most sadistic punishments was the freezing treatment. Women were ordered to stand outside in the cold, sometimes in winter, sometimes after having water poured over their heads, until their limbs turned numb. They stood for hours, the wind slicing through their thin dresses, their teeth chattering violently. Some collapsed from hypothermia, their bodies shaking uncontrollably. Guards kicked them until they stood. If they could not, they were dragged away, often never seen again. The dogs were another tool of terror. Large German shepherds, trained meticulously to attack, patrolled the camp beside the guards. These dogs were not mere animals. They were extensions of their handlers, trained to respond to subtle signals, to enforce order through violence. They tore into women's legs, arms, faces. The sound of a dog snarling became enough to silence an entire barrack. Many women bore scars from these attacks. Some lost fingers or chunks of flesh. Others died from infections after being mauled. The guards used humiliation as often as they used violence. Women were forced to strip naked during inspections, even in the dead of winter. Guards mocked their bodies, how thin they were, how scarred, how bruised. They berated older women, calling them useless. They ridiculed pregnant women, knowing full well that pregnancy often led to sterilization or death. They forced prisoners to crawl on the ground, to bark like animals, to stand in unnatural positions until their muscles spasmed. The purpose was not discipline. The purpose was degradation. Inside the barracks, nighttime offered no refuge. Guards burst in without warning, dragging women outside, shouting accusations, demanding confessions for crimes that had never been committed. They conducted surprise searches, tearing apart bunks, confiscating personal belongings, a small mirror, a scrap of cloth, a handmade hair tie, a photo of a loved one. These small possessions were priceless to the women, fragile reminders of their identities. Losing them felt like losing part of themselves. Sometimes punishments extended to entire barracks. If one woman was found with contraband, or if a guard simply wished to exert power, the entire group suffered. They were forced to stand for hours in the cold. Their food rations were cut. Some were denied sleep for nights at a time. Collective punishment created tension among the prisoners, but more often, it bonded them in shared misery. The SS also used sexualized violence as a method of control, not always through rape, but through invasive examinations, forced nudity, and humiliating medical procedures. Women were treated not as humans, but as objects to be inspected, violated, or modified according to Nazi ideology. Every interaction with a guard carried the threat of bodily harm. The psychological toll was immense. Women lived in constant fear of the guards, jumping at the sound of footsteps, trembling during roll call, whispering about the punishments they had witnessed. Many lost weight rapidly, their bodies wasting away from stress as much as starvation. Sleep became a fragile, broken thing, interrupted by screams, nightmares, and the knowledge that at any moment a guard could drag them outside. Some guards developed reputations so terrifying that prisoners avoided looking at them. One guard, known for her cruelty toward Jewish women specifically, once beat a woman to death simply because she stumbled during work. Another forced a group of prisoners to carry a heavy log around the yard for hours until several collapsed, their bodies crumpling like paper. These guards were not anomalies. They were products of a system that rewarded obedience, brutality, and efficiency. But brutality did not stop the women from resisting in small ways. They whispered warnings to each other when a cruel guard approached. They hid weak prisoners during inspections. They helped each other stand after beatings. They washed one another's wounds with stolen water. These acts of compassion were dangerous, punishable by death, but essential for survival. Sometimes resistance took surprising forms. Women memorized poems, recited them quietly at night, and shared them like precious contraband. They taught each other languages. They held secret discussions about politics, philosophy, home. These conversations kept their minds alive when the rest of their world was collapsing. One night, during a thunderstorm, a group of women in Barrack 12 gathered around a frail prisoner who had been beaten earlier in the day. They held her hands, hummed a Polish lullaby, and shielded her body from the drafts. When she died at dawn, they wept silently, knowing they must hide their grief from the guards. Mourning was forbidden. Even tears were dangerous. The brutality intensified as the war turned against Germany. Hearing distant bombings made the guards more volatile. They punished women for the smallest infractions, projecting their fear of defeat onto the prisoners. They lashed out, desperate to maintain control in a world that was slipping away from them. The imprisonment of Jewish women escalated the violence further. The guards targeted them with ferocity, blaming them for Germany's failures, just as Nazi propaganda had taught them. Jewish women suffered the harshest punishments, the most dangerous work, the most frequent selections. The guards seemed to relish their suffering. The arrival of Hungarian Jewish women in 1944 brought the brutality to its peak. These women had survived ghettos, deportation, sometimes even Auschwitz. They arrived emaciated, traumatized, and immediately became targets. Guards struck them during registration. Dogs lunged at them during roll call. They were forced to perform tasks beyond their physical ability, and when they collapsed, they were beaten or selected for extermination. As the camp grew more chaotic, the guards' cruelty became more frenzied. They used punishments to maintain order, but also to vent their own desperation. Women were shot for stepping out of line. Others were whipped until they could not stand. Some were hanged in front of the entire camp as a warning. And then, beneath this brutality, something even more sinister developed. The SS began planning systematic murder inside the camp. The gas chamber. By late 1944, The guards carried a new kind of authority, a cold certainty that they could eliminate any prisoner without consequence. Punishments became a prelude to death. Selections increased. The infirmary became a place of execution. The guards' brutality was no longer random. It was part of a larger machinery now built into the camp's operations. The violence grew organized, efficient, industrial. Yet for all the cruelty the guards unleashed, they never fully subdued the women of Ravensbrück. Each beating was met with silent endurance, each humiliation with defiant dignity, each act of violence with whispered solidarity. The women held each other up, literally and spiritually, through storms of brutality that no one should endure. But Ravensbrück was entering its final and deadliest phase. The gas chamber was complete. The SS had new orders. The overcrowding had reached a point where the camp could no longer sustain itself through starvation and labor alone. Mass extermination was coming, and the women who had survived torture, beatings, forced labor, and medical experiments would soon face a new terror, one that threatened not only their bodies, but the last fragile hope that had kept them alive. Chapter 12. Resistance inside the camp. Smuggling, sabotage, and secret lists. It did not begin with loud declarations or dramatic revolts. It began with a glance, a whisper, a touch on the arm, something so small that a guard would never notice it, yet powerful enough to shift the balance between despair and defiance. In a place built to erase individuality, to crush hope, to extinguish the human spirit, the women of Ravensbrück discovered that survival depended not only on endurance, but on connection. And from these fragile connections, resistance grew. Ravensbrück was designed to prevent rebellion. Its architecture, its routines, its punishments, its psychological warfare, everything was built to isolate, to divide, to terrify. The SS believed that women from different nations, languages, backgrounds, and beliefs would never unite. They believed hunger, exhaustion, and brutality would silence every whisper of defiance. But they misunderstood the prisoners. They misunderstood the power of women bound together and suffering. They misunderstood the depth of courage that emerges when the world leaves no other choice. The first acts of resistance were almost invisible. A woman shared a piece of bread with someone weaker. Another hid a sick prisoner during roll call, risking a beating or worse. Some slipped into forbidden areas to steal scraps of fabric, potatoes, bits of soap, precious items that meant comfort, warmth, survival. These small acts were defiance, even if no one called them that at the time. They were the first cracks in the system the Nazis thought was impenetrable. But resistance soon became more organized, more deliberate, more dangerous. The arrival of political prisoners, especially Polish, French, German, and Soviet women, brought skills that changed everything. These women had experience in underground activism. They knew how to communicate secretly, how to smuggle messages, how to forge networks of trust beneath layers of surveillance. They recognized the signs of an oppressive system and understood the need to undermine it from within. One of the most remarkable acts of resistance was the creation of secret lists. It began when the medical experiment started. Prisoners realized that the rabbits, the women subjected to bone-breaking procedures, nerve-severing, infections, were being hidden by the SS. Their injuries were concealed. Their names disappeared from official reports. The camp leadership intended to eliminate them quietly, so no evidence of the experiments would remain. But the prisoners refused to let these women vanish into silence. They began recording names, numbers, nationalities, details of injuries. They memorized information and repeated it to women in other barracks who could write it down. They tore bits of paper from cement sacks, cigarette wrappers, scraps of fabric. They stole pencils and charcoal. Slowly, carefully the list grew. It was hidden in the hems of dresses, sewn into blankets, buried beneath floorboards, smuggled out in the lining of coats sent to external factories. If the SS discovered these lists, everyone involved would be killed. But the prisoners believed the world needed to know what had happened here. At night, women whispered each name again and again, committing them to memory in case the physical lists were lost. Some recited the names like prayers. Others repeated them silently as they drifted into uneasy sleep. The list became a lifeline, proof that the prisoners were not forgotten, not erased, not alone. Resistance also emerged in the factories. In the seamen's workshop, the women learned quickly how to sabotage the machines that fed the Nazi war effort. They loosened screws, weakened wires, misaligned components, filed metal parts incorrectly. They worked with precision, not so much sabotage that they would be caught instantly, but enough to undermine entire batches of electrical devices. Women pretended to be clumsy. They pretended not to understand instructions. They let defective parts pass inspection. They hid pieces of equipment inside their clothing, knowing that even the smallest disruption might save a life on the battlefield. Some women became so skilled at sabotage that they trained others. They created a network of saboteurs, each woman whispering instructions to the next. Sabotage spread through the factory lines like an invisible thread. The SS could not understand how so many parts failed. They blamed poor materials. They blamed workers' incompetence. They increased punishments. But the sabotage continued. It became a silent war fought inside the walls of Ravensbruck. Resistance also emerged in communication. Women found ways to pass information across the camp. A glance exchanged in the roll call line. A note slipped into a shoe. A message scratched into a bar of soap. They developed a symbolic language, gestures that meant danger, safety, opportunity. Women pretended to tie their shoes while whispering news from other blocks. They sang coded messages and lullabies. They tapped patterns on the barrack walls to share warnings about upcoming selections. And then there were the escape attempts, rare but breathtaking in their courage. A few women tried to slip out during work details, hiding among trees or slipping into shadows when guards were distracted. Most were caught. Some were shot. But their attempts inspired others. Each attempt, even when it failed, reminded the prisoners that the SS was not infallible. Resistance grew in unexpected places. One of the most remarkable moments of defiance occurred when prisoners were ordered to sew winter coats for German soldiers. The women deliberately stitched the lining too tight, restricting arm movement. They sewed seams that unraveled. They used thread so weak it broke in the cold. They sabotaged thousands of coats, small, barely noticeable flaws that might slow a soldier, cost him seconds, weaken morale. Women assigned to weave blankets for the Luftwaffe replaced warm wool with weaker materials, causing the blankets to tear easily. Those who sewed boots stitched them with incorrect patterns so the soles detached. Those who worked with electrical devices bent copper wires so subtly that they failed under pressure. Prisoners in the infirmary also resisted. Nurses who were prisoners sabotaged medical supplies intended for guards. They diluted disinfectant, replaced medications with harmless powders, or miscounted bandages. Some hid Jewish women during selections by swapping identity cards. Others forged documents to save the sick from being taken away. And then there was spiritual resistance. Even in the darkest moments, women clung to faith, culture, and memory. Jewish women whispered fragments of Hebrew prayers. Catholic women made rosaries from threads and beads scavenged from clothing. Orthodox women crossed themselves quietly during roll call. These acts were forbidden and dangerous, yet essential. Some prisoners held secret classes, teaching languages, mathematics, or history. They recited poetry. They told stories. They sang softly at night. These small acts kept the mind alive. They reminded the women that they were more than the suffering inflicted upon them. Resistance also took the form of protection. When a woman was too weak to stand during roll call, others held her upright. When a woman fainted, others caught her before guards could notice. When a woman was targeted by a brutal guard, others formed a shield around her, taking blows themselves to protect her. One of the most extraordinary acts of resistance occurred when the SS ordered all Polish women under 30 to report for a transport. The prisoners knew what that meant, death. But the Polish women refused. They barricaded themselves in the barracks. They locked arms. They lay across the doorway. They sang. They shouted. They resisted with every ounce of strength left in their starved bodies. The SS stormed in with dogs, rifles, and batons. The women fought back, not with weapons, but with the force of their unity. They refused to move. They refused to give up their friends. The guards were shocked. They had expected obedience, fear, submission. Instead, they found courage. Eventually, the SS withdrew. The transport was canceled. The women survived. But resistance in Ravensbruck carried immense risk. When a guard discovered a smuggled note, the entire barrack was punished. When sabotage was detected, women were beaten, starved, or killed. When lists of experiments were found sewn into a prisoner's clothing, the woman was tortured until she fainted. Still, the resistance continued. Women smuggled information to the outside through German civilians forced to work within the camp. They passed notes hidden in clothing, rolled into thread spools, or stuffed inside shoes. Some of these messages reached the Swedish Red Cross, British intelligence, or resistance groups in Berlin. The outside world began hearing whispers of the horrors inside Ravensbrück. These whispers would later become evidence at war crimes trials. One of the most daring acts of resistance occurred in late 1944, when prisoners learned that the SS planned to kill the rabbits. The women united. They hid the rabbits under bunks, beneath piles of straw, behind walls. They created daily rotations of watchers who kept track of guards' movements. They used misinformation to confuse the SS about the women's whereabouts. When the SS searched one barrack, the rabbits were smuggled to another. When the SS prepared a selection, prisoners disrupted roll call by collapsing, coughing, shouting, forcing the guards to abandon their plans. Every day the rabbits survived was a victory. Resistance also took place in the kitchen, where prisoner cooks stole bits of potatoes, onions, and bread, slipping them to the sickest women. These women risked execution, yet they continued. They had scraps beneath skirts, inside sleeves, inside ladles. Some even stole small amounts of meat meant for guards. In the sewing workshops, women made warm undergarments for those who were freezing. They stitched pockets in a clothing so women could hide messages or smuggled food. They reused thread repeatedly, unraveling it at night to share among the barracks. The courage of these acts was amplified by scarcity. Every crumb stolen was a crumb taken from a guard's plate. Every tool smuggled was a tool denied to the SS. Every moment spent resisting was a moment that could end in punishment. Yet the women continued, because resistance meant more than survival. It meant reclaiming a sliver of humanity, even for a moment. In the final months of the war, resistance became an act of documenting truth. Women wrote names of the dead on scraps of cement bags. They etched numbers into wood. They scratched messages into metal spoons. They hid these records beneath barracks, in latrine walls, under the infirmary floor. They believed that even if they died, their stories might someday be found. And many were. After liberation, these scraps were discovered, tiny pieces of the untold history of Ravensbrück. But as the camp neared its end, resistance faced its greatest challenge. The SS constructed a gas chamber. Rumors reached the women through whispers carried on the wind. Smoke rising from a new building, ash settling on clothing, guards standing watch at night with nervous expressions. The women understood immediately. The resistance had helped them endure forced labor, medical experiments, starvation, brutality. It had helped them keep their souls alive. But now, the camp itself was becoming a place of systematic extermination. They would need every ounce of courage, every connection, every act of defiance to survive the months ahead. The next chapter would reveal the final descent, the gas chamber, the selections, and the desperate struggle to stay alive as Ravensbrück turned into a place of mass death. But the women were not done resisting. Not yet. Chapter 13, Gas Chambers at Ravensbrück. The final stage of extermination, 1944 to 1945. It began quietly, almost invisibly, as if the camp itself were trying to hide what it was becoming. For years, Ravensbrück had been a place of punishment, forced labor, starvation, and medical torture. Thousands had died, not by machinery, but by exhaustion, infection, beatings, exposure, and deliberate neglect. Death had been scattered, unpredictable, a constant shadow. But in late 1944, something changed. Death was no longer a byproduct. It was a plan. It had an architecture. It had a schedule. And it had a building designed for it. The first sign was construction, strange activity in a far corner of the camp, beyond the barracks, near the crematorium. Prisoners saw men in civilian clothing, working under SS supervision, raising walls from prefabricated slabs. They heard the thud of hammers, the scrape of shovels, the murmur of discussions carried on the wind. The guard said nothing. They avoided the sight and barked orders if prisoners turned their heads. But the women of Ravensbruck were observant, and fear sharpened every sense. Some recognized the shape of the building. They had heard stories from Auschwitz, from Majdanek, from Sobibor, stories carried by transports of Jewish prisoners who spoke in hushed voices about gas chambers disguised as showers, about chimneys that belched smoke day and night, about entire families disappearing. Now, that architecture was rising inside Ravensbrück. The camp had reached a breaking point. Transport after transport had arrived from across Nazi-occupied Europe. Hungarian Jews, Romani women, Polish political prisoners, French resistance fighters, Soviet partisans. The camp was bursting. Starvation ravaged thousands. Typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and tuberculosis spread rapidly through the barracks. Women fainted at roll call, collapsed at work, died in their bunks. The SS no longer had space to store bodies. The crematorium ran constantly, its chimney sending thin ribbons of smoke into the sky that drifted over the lake and settled on the women's skin like ash. But even these deaths were not enough for the regime. Himmler had ordered increased extermination as Germany's defeat loomed. Prisoners who could no longer work were deemed useless. Jewish prisoners were targeted systematically. Political prisoners considered dangerous were marked for removal. The sick overcrowded the infirmary. The SS feared epidemics. They feared revolt. They feared witnesses. So the solution was simple: eliminate them in batches. The building completed in early 1945 looked like a laundry facility or a storage hall. It had a sloping roof, small windows, and a heavy wooden door. Inside, one room was sealed tight, reinforced with concrete, fitted with a vent system. The women who worked near the site saw pipes being laid, metal fittings installed, and crews testing the ventilation. They noticed guards standing outside with unusual tension, their hands resting on pistol holsters. They heard the commandant shouting at engineers. They felt a shift in the air, and then the smoke changed. It became darker, thicker, more frequent. One morning, prisoners saw ashes drifting down like gray snow. Some women reached out and caught the flakes on their fingertips. They crumbled into nothing at the slightest touch. Someone whispered, "These are people." A silence fell that felt like suffocation. Rumors spread with terrifying speed. Some believed the gas chamber was already operating. Others thought it had not yet opened. But everyone understood the truth. The camp had entered a phase of mass killing. The selections intensified. Guards moved through the barracks with clipboards, pointing at women who were too thin, too sick, too exhausted, too pregnant, too injured, too outspoken. These women were taken to a holding area near the new building. They were told they were being transferred. They were told they would bathe. They were told nothing at all. The process changed daily. Sometimes women were marched directly to the gas chamber. Other times they were stripped first, their clothes piled outside. Some were taken in groups of 10, some in groups of 50. The SS made no attempt to hide their intent. Their cruelty grew bold, almost frantic, as if they knew time was running out. Inside the barracks, fear spread like a virus. Women no longer whispered when selections approached. They gripped each other's hands, pressed together in the shadows, trying to become invisible. Mothers hid daughters beneath blankets. Younger women tried to stand tall, forcing strength into their collapsing limbs. Older prisoners gave their food to the young, hoping to help them survive one more inspection. But the gas chamber did not only claim the weak. It claimed anyone the SS wished to erase. Some guards chose women at random. A glance deemed insolent. A limp noticed during work. A woman too slow in responding to a command. A Jewish prisoner who dared to look up. A Roma woman who spoke her native language. A Polish partisan identified by an informant. A French prisoner rumored to have helped in sabotage. Death was arbitrary and methodical at the same time. The process of killing was mechanical. Women were marched inside the chamber. The heavy doors sealed shut. The gas released through vents. The sound of fists pounding on metal echoed across the yard. Some women screamed prayers. Others clawed at the walls. Most died within minutes. Their bodies were dragged out by male prisoners who had been forced into service in the crematorium. A Sonderkommando unit so traumatized that silence became their only language. These men, skeletal and hollow-eyed, hauled corpses onto metal trays and pushed them into the cremation ovens. The smell of burning flesh became a permanent fixture of the camp. It seeped into the barracks, clung to clothing, settled into hair. Women tasted it in the air. They swallowed it with every breath. The gas chamber was small, much smaller than those at Auschwitz, so the killings were done repeatedly, day after day. Each session consumed dozens, sometimes hundreds. Some evenings, the chamber operated all night, the glow of the crematorium lighting the sky like an infernal sunrise. In the midst of this horror, the prisoners fought not only for survival, but for truth. They began documenting the deaths. Secret lists were updated, even as the camp spiraled into chaos. Women memorized the names of those taken, whispered them to others, repeated them in the darkness, so they would not be forgotten. They wrote tiny notes on scraps of paper and hid them in cracks in the walls, in the linings of coats, beneath the barack floorboards. They risked being beaten, tortured, shot, because they understood that the world might never know the truth unless they recorded it. Some women tried to rescue others from selections. They swapped clothes with sick prisoners. They forged entries in work rosters. They hid the weakest among piles of straw. They raised the hoods of younger prisoners to hide their faces. They created diversions, small disturbances, collapses, coughing fits, to confuse the SS long enough to slip someone back into the line. In one remarkable act of defiance, when guards attempted to seize a group of Jewish women for gassing, a barack of political prisoners formed a human wall around them. They locked arms. They stood tall. They refused to move. Guards shouted, threatened, struck them, unleashed dogs, but the women did not separate. The SS, overwhelmed by the sudden chaos, backed off. But such victories were rare. The machinery of death ground relentlessly. The crematorium could not keep up. Bodies piled outside like cordwood. Men forced to work inside the cremation area grew numb, their souls buried beneath ash and horror. They recognized women who had once smiled at them during work details, women who had whispered greetings, women who had shared bread. Now they lifted their bodies without ceremony, because ceremony was impossible. Only death was constant. And yet, amid this industrial slaughter, moments of humanity emerged, fragile as embers in a storm. Women held hands inside the gas chamber, refusing to face death alone. Mothers shielded daughters with their bodies. Younger women whispered comfort to older prisoners. Some sang softly, hymns or lullabies or songs from their childhood. Even in their final moments, they asserted their existence. The guards, meanwhile, existed in a strange duality. Some reveled in this new power. They strutted near the gas chamber, boasting about their role in the final solution. They mocked prisoners begging for mercy. They laughed as women stumbled toward their deaths. Others showed signs of unraveling. They drank heavily. Their cruelty became more frantic, as if driven by desperation. Some avoided the area entirely, unable to face what they were participating in. But fear of punishment silenced any hesitation. The SS hierarchy demanded compliance. Disobedience was unthinkable. The gas chamber was supposed to be efficient, controlled, quiet, but the camp itself was collapsing. By early 1945, the front lines were approaching. The thunder of artillery echoed in the distance. Sometimes the ground trembled at night, and women lifted their heads from their bunks, wondering whether the war was drawing closer or whether the gas chamber was operating again. With the Soviet army advancing, the SS accelerated exterminations. They wanted Ravensbrück emptied, its witnesses gone, its crimes concealed. Transports to the gas chamber increased. Selections grew more aggressive. The infirmary became a site of injections, where phenol or gasoline was pushed into veins with cold efficiency. Women died silently on cots and were dragged away before their bodies cooled. One morning, prisoners noticed that the sky above the crematorium was darker than usual, filled with thick black smoke that stung their eyes. Rumors swept the camp. The SS were burning documents, burning records, burning evidence. They were preparing to abandon the camp and kill as many prisoners as possible before they fled. The women realized that this was the final stage. Survival now depended not only on resisting selections, but on hiding, blending, disappearing into the barrack crowds. Some women exchanged clothing with those in safer labor groups. Others smeared dirt on their faces to appear healthier. Still others begged fellow prisoners to remember their names if they did not survive. In the final weeks, a strange thing happened. The gas chamber continued operating, but inconsistently. Sometimes it lay silent for days, the door hanging open, the air heavy with the remnants of death. Guards looked nervous. They argued among themselves. They drank more. They struck prisoners for no reason. Discipline frayed. Inside the barracks, the women sensed a shift. Hope, a dangerous, flickering emotion, began to stir. Some dared to believe liberation was coming. Others feared the SS would kill them all before the Allies arrived. The truth was both. In early April 1945, the gas chamber continued killing even as armored divisions approached. Until nearly the last moment, the SS disposed of prisoners with mechanical indifference. Some women were marched directly from roll call to death. The crematorium burned constantly, its final victims disappearing into smoke that curled across the lake in dark spirals. But then, abruptly, the machinery stopped. The guards began evacuating the camp, forcing thousands of women onto death marches, brutal treks through winter terrain with no food, no shelter, no hope. The gas chamber stood silent, its walls still warm from recent use. The SS had run out of time. When Soviet soldiers finally entered Ravensbrück on April 30th, they found the gas chamber empty, the ovens still warm, ashes piled high. They found women barely alive, skeletal, trembling, unable to comprehend that liberation had come. They found evidence of mass murder, mountains of clothing, bones in the ash pits, scraps of hair, human remains inside the cremation ovens. The camp's darkest secret was no longer a rumor. It was carved into the ground itself. The women who survived carried the memories of the gas chamber with them for the rest of their lives. Some never spoke of it again. Others testified at war crimes trials. Some wrote memoirs. But all remembered the sound of the trucks, the smell of the smoke, the silence that followed the final screams. And yet, even in this horror, even in the shadow of industrial death, something extraordinary remained. The women of Ravensbrück had resisted. They had protected one another. They had recorded the truth. They had refused to let the camp erase them. But liberation did not bring immediate peace. For thousands of women forced on death marches, the nightmare continued outside the camp. And for those who remained inside Ravensbrück, freedom came with overwhelming uncertainty, cold, hunger, trauma, sickness, and the weight of everything they had endured. The next chapter would reveal the chaos and desperation of the final days, when the camp collapsed and the women struggled to survive the deadly marches, the betrayals, and the long-awaited arrival of liberation. Chapter 14. The Death Marches and the Collapse of the Camp. It began with an unease in the air, a tension so sharp that women felt it in their bones before anything was said aloud. Guards whispered to each other more urgently. Trucks moved in and out of the camp at odd hours. The sound of distant gunfire grew louder each day. Prisoners saw officers gathering in tight clusters, glancing over their shoulders as they spoke in hushed voices. They watched the fear rising in the very faces that once inflicted terror. The war was closing in. Germany was collapsing. And Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp in Nazi Europe, had begun to unravel from within. The prisoners sensed change before they understood it. They lifted their heads during roll call, noticing that the guards seemed distracted, their movements sharper, their tempers even more volatile. Some guards struck women for the smallest infractions. Others stared past the rows of prisoners with hollowed eyes, as if already imagining escape routes. The camp had always been a machine of fear, but now fear infected even the machine operators. Then, one night, an unfamiliar silence swept across the camp. It was the kind of silence that follows after something breaks. Several guards gathered near the crematorium, their faces lit by the orange glow of burning papers. Thick smoke drifted across the yard, carrying the unmistakable smell of burning documents, photographs, logs, evidence. The SS were destroying their records. They burned transport lists, execution orders, punishment documents, medical experiment files. Flames consumed years of brutality, crackling like dry branches snapping underfoot. Women in the barracks watched through slits in the walls as the sky turned black above the camp, swallowing the stars. Some whispered, "It is the end." Others whispered, "It is the beginning." Rumors began swirling through the barracks with feverish speed. The Soviets were approaching. The front was collapsing. The SS had orders to evacuate the camp. An evacuation did not mean freedom. It meant death marches, brutal, relentless treks meant to kill as many prisoners as possible before the Allies arrived. Women who had survived medical experiments, forced labor, starvation, torture, and selections now faced a new horror: walking until their bodies broke, or being shot if they stumbled. The first orders came in early April 1945. Women were pulled from the barracks in groups, sometimes by number, sometimes by category, sometimes seemingly at random. Political prisoners, Jewish prisoners, Roma women, French resistance fighters, mothers who had clung to hope, teenagers who had grown old inside the barbed wire. They were told to gather outside with whatever they could carry. Most had nothing. A few gripped blankets or shoes tied with string. Some carried the arms of women too weak to move without support. Then the doors swung open. The gates creaked, and the march began. The death marches started quietly, with no announcement, no explanation. Guards barked orders. Dogs snarled. Prisoners stepped into the cold spring air, blinking against the rising sun. Rows of women stretched out before them, lines so long they disappeared into the mist. Some women turned back, casting one last look at Ravensbruck, its watchtowers silhouetted against the sky, wondering if they would ever return, wondering if they even wanted to. The first steps were agonizing. Many women had feet swollen from frostbite, infections, or standing for hours during roll call. Some wore only wooden clogs that rubbed their heels raw. Others walked barefoot, their feet bleeding onto the road. The guards marched them at a brutal pace, pushing them forward relentlessly. The path led through forests, across fields, past villages where civilians watched from windows with guarded curiosity or silent indifference. Some villagers looked away. Others stared openly. A few tossed scraps of bread when guards weren't looking. Many did nothing. If a woman stumbled, she was beaten. If she fell, she was shot. The guards did not pause. A gunshot on the road was not an interruption. It was part of the rhythm of the march. Some women tried to help the fallen. They slowed their pace, tried to lift a friend, whispered desperate encouragements. But guards struck them with rifle butts until they moved on. The women had to choose between trying to save someone they loved or being shot beside them. Many lived with guilt for decades, haunted by the faces they could not save. As the marches continued, the landscape became a blur: mud, trees, villages, fields, and bodies scattered along the roadside. The women were exhausted, starving, terrified. Their world had shrunk to a single goal: take the next step. Inside the camp, chaos grew. Not all women were sent on the first marches. Some were kept for later groups. Some hid. Some were too sick to move. The infirmary overflowed. Bodies covered the floors. German doctors abandoned the building, leaving the dying to care for the dying. Prisoners who remained in the camp watched as guards frantically packed their belongings. Suitcases stuffed with uniforms, food, alcohol, even stolen items taken for prisoners. Trucks loaded with plunder rumbled out of the gates. One guard was seen carrying a crate filled with jewelry confiscated from Jewish women, her hands trembling as she tried to secure it. Even in their final days of control, the SS clung to greed. But while the guard prepared to flee, the prisoners prepared to survive. Women hid beneath barracks, slipping into crawl spaces so narrow they could barely breathe. Others wedged themselves behind crates, under bunks, inside latrine pits, or in piles of rotting straw. Some dug shallow depressions in the ground, covering themselves with blankets and debris. The women who hid were not only trying to escape the marches, they were also trying to protect the remaining rabbits, the women who had been mutilated during medical experiments. These women could not march. Their legs were too damaged, their bodies too frail. They would be killed instantly if discovered. So the prisoners took it upon themselves to disguise them, hide them, smuggle them between barracks as selections swept through. Every act of hiding was an act of rebellion. Every night inside the collapsing camp was filled with danger. Guards barged into barracks, searching for women who had slipped away. They dragged out prisoners and shot them. They set dogs loose. They shouted threats that echoed across the yard. Yet still women hid. Outside the camp, the death marches continued through forests thick with spring mud. Rain fell. Wind cut through thin clothing. Women shivered violently as temperatures dropped at night. Some whispered prayers. Others recited stories or poems to keep their minds conscious. Some sang quietly. Songs from home, lullabies from childhood, hymns from faith they no longer practiced but still held in their hearts. Hunger gnawed at them constantly. Bellies twisted in pain. Some women chewed grass or leaves. Others picked grains from the mud. A few lucky ones found potatoes abandoned in fields. When they discovered food, they shared it. Tiny bites exchanged between trembling fingers. On one march, a woman collapsed, unable to move. Her best friend knelt beside her, cradling her head, whispering words of love into her ear as the guards approached. She refused to let go even when the rifles were raised. The woman died in her arms. The guards dragged the survivor away, beating her until she could barely walk. She marched on, tears freezing against her cheeks. Another woman, a mother, carried her teenage daughter for miles on her back. When her strength finally failed, other women took turns carrying the girl. They formed a chain of help, lifting her every time she stumbled. One night, as they huddled together for warmth, the girl died quietly in her mother's arms. At dawn, the mother refused to leave her. The guard shot her. The women walked on. Not all guards participated willingly. Some were visibly shaken, their hands trembling as they walked. Others drank heavily, stumbling through the march, shouting incoherently. A few guards vanished into the forests, deserting their posts. But the remaining SS were enough. Too many, too violent, too determined to enforce death until the final moment of the war. Back inside Ravensbruck, the camp's population dwindled. Most of those who could walk had been forced out. The women who remained were skeletal, sick, delirious. Roll calls fell apart. Guards stopped counting. The camp became eerily silent. Even the dogs stopped barking. One morning, women awoke to find that many of the guards were gone. Doors to the barracks hung open. The electrified fence buzzed weakly, its power flickering. The watchtowers, once manned day and night, stood empty, a chilling sight, because empty towers meant something unimaginable. The guards were fleeing. Liberation was near. But liberation was not gentle. It did not arrive as a triumphant roar. It arrived as confusion, chaos, and desperation. Women stumbled out of the barracks, blinking in the pale daylight, unsure whether this was real. Some collapsed, too weak to stand. Others wandered the camp in a daze, searching for friends who had vanished during the marches. Then the distant sound of engines grew louder. Soviet tanks. The Red Army approached through the forest, cautious, weapons raised. When they entered the camp, they were met not with resistance, but with the fragile bodies of survivors, women who had endured starvation, torture, forced labor, gas chambers, and death marches. The soldiers stared in shock, unsure how to offer comfort to beings who looked like ghosts. Some women fell to their knees. Others wept openly. Some clung to the soldiers, whispering thank yous in languages the soldiers could not understand. A few stood silent, numb, unable to process freedom after years of confinement. But for thousands of women still on the marches, liberation came differently. Many were freed by advancing Allied forces, Soviets, Americans, British, who intercepted the columns of starving prisoners. Soldiers handed out rations, blankets, water. Women devoured the food desperately, sometimes so fast that their weakened bodies could not handle it. Some died from the shock of nourishment. Others survived only because fellow prisoners restrained them, feeding them slowly. Some women were abandoned by guards who fled in panic, leaving the prisoners in forests or fields with no direction. These women gathered themselves, used scraps of maps, followed roads, and walked toward the sounds of artillery, toward the front lines, toward the hope of liberation. Others wandered for days before encountering civilians willing to help. Some were taken into homes, given warm meals, wrapped in clean blankets. Others were turned away by villagers too afraid or too complicit to offer help. Many women died just steps from freedom. Their bodies lay in ditches, on roadsides, beneath trees. Some held hands when they died. Others whispered their names to strangers, hoping that someone might remember them. Inside the camp, liberation marked the end of one horror and the beginning of another, the struggle to live again. Women lay on the barrack floors, waiting for medical help. They coughed blood. They vomited. They trembled with fever. Their bodies, pushed beyond all natural limits, began collapsing under the weight of survival. Some died in the hours after liberation. Others died in the days that followed, their hearts too weak to carry the memory of suffering any longer. But many lived. Many stood. Many walked out of Ravensbruck with the strength of survivors who understood they had witnessed something the world must never forget. The camp had collapsed. The SS had fled. But the women, the ones who endured the gas chamber shadow, the brutality of the guards, the torture, the starvation, the medical experiments, the death marches, they remained. In the next chapter, their story would be written not behind barbed wire, but in courts, in testimonies, in memorials, in the memories of those who refused to let Ravensbruck fade into silence. Because the end of the camp was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of justice. Chapter 15, Liberation, Justice, and the Memory of Ravensbruck. It began with footsteps, heavy boots crunching across gravel, but not the boots the women had learned to fear. This time the rhythm was different, slower, hesitant. The air carried not the familiar shouts of SS guards, but unfamiliar voices speaking Russian, voices sharp with caution as soldiers scanned the ruins of the camp. On the morning of April 30th, 1945, the gates of Ravensbruck, gates that had swallowed more than 100,000 women from across Europe, swung open to the advancing Soviet army. Liberation arrived not as a triumphant roar, but as a stunned silence, a quiet so deep that it seemed the camp itself was holding its breath. And then, slowly, in trembling moments, the women realized that the nightmare was ending. The first soldiers who entered Ravensbruck did not know what they were walking into. They expected resistance, perhaps an ambush. Instead, they found empty watchtowers, abandoned rifles, scattered uniforms, and the skeletal remains of a system collapsing in on itself. They found women, hundreds of them, wandering between barracks like ghosts, barefoot, starving, trembling, their eyes hollow from years of brutality. Some stood frozen as the soldiers approached, unsure whether this was another trick. Others reached out with frail hands, clinging to the sleeves of men who seemed just as shocked as they were. A few women knelt, overwhelmed, unable to stand any longer under the weight of relief. The Soviet soldiers were unprepared for the sight. Many recoiled at the stench of sickness and decay that clung to every inch of the camp. They saw bodies piled near the crematorium, corpses half-burned, their limbs twisted in unnatural shapes. They saw the gas chamber, its door hanging open, the walls stained with the residue of mass murder. They saw the infirmary littered with makeshift beds, each one holding a woman so emaciated she appeared only moments from death. Ravensbruck was not merely a place of suffering. It was a graveyard still breathing, still whispering. For the women who had survived, liberation was a moment filled with conflicting emotions: joy, disbelief, fear, confusion. Some ran toward the soldiers, tears streaming down their faces. Others hid, conditioned by years of terror to distrust any uniform. A few fainted in relief. Many stared blankly, unable to comprehend freedom. They had spent days expecting the SS to return, expecting another selection, expecting the gas chamber or the death marches. The concept of safety felt like a distant memory, something they no longer knew how to feel. The soldiers tried to help, offering water, bread, blankets. But the women's bodies, ravaged by starvation, could not handle sudden nourishment. Some ate too quickly and collapsed. Doctors, Soviet medics, civilian volunteers, nurses who had once been prisoners themselves, rushed through the camp, trying to stabilize as many women as possible. They bandaged wounds, cleaned infections, took temperatures, injected antibiotics. But the infirmary was overflowing. There were too many to treat. And every hour, more women died. Died not because they were still imprisoned, but because liberation had come too late for their weakened bodies. Still, in the midst of this heartbreak, small miracles unfolded. Women found friends they thought long dead. Sisters reunited. Mothers recognized daughters. A Polish woman discovered her childhood neighbor. A French prisoner embraced a woman she had last seen in a resistance cell. These reunions were fragile, tears mingling with joy and grief. But they reminded the survivors that part of themselves still existed beyond the fences. Yet liberation was only the first step. The world outside Ravensbrück was not ready for the flood of broken lives that emerged from the camp. Once the initial shock passed, the survivors faced the impossible task of rebuilding who they were. Some could barely stand. Others could barely speak. Many had no homes to return to. Villages burned, families murdered, communities destroyed. Some had no idea whether anyone they loved was still alive. The Red Army set up field hospitals, feeding stations, and temporary shelters. They organized transport for women who could travel. But chaos reigned across the collapsing Third Reich. Roads were dangerous. Cities lay in ruins. Borders shifted. Refugee columns stretched across Europe. Millions of displaced people searching for safety, for food, for the lives they had lost. Ravensbrück survivors, wearing tattered dresses and carrying nothing but memories, joined these endless streams. Some survivors were taken in by relief organizations, Swedish nurses, Danish volunteers, the International Red Cross. Sweden in particular became a haven. Count Folke Bernadotte had organized the White Buses rescue mission in the war's final weeks, evacuating Scandinavian prisoners from Ravensbrück before liberation. Those buses saved thousands of lives. Many of the women taken to Sweden regained health in hospitals, embraced by a nation determined to help them start anew. For others, the journey home was a nightmare of its own. A Russian prisoner returning east faced suspicion from Stalin's regime, which believed anyone captured by the Germans might be a traitor. Some were interrogated, imprisoned again, or sent to Soviet labor camps. Polish survivors returned to a homeland carved up between new powers. Jewish women returned to find their families murdered, their homes occupied, their communities erased. The war had liberated them from one horror, only to deliver them into another. The horror of discovering the full extent of what they had lost. Survival was not the end of suffering. Many women battled lifelong trauma, nightmares, chronic pain from medical experiments, infertility from sterilization, infection scars, anxiety, flashbacks, silence that swallowed them whole. They carried Ravensbrück inside them long after they walked out of its gates. But they also carried something else, their voices. Slowly, painfully, they began to speak. Some testified before military tribunals. Others spoke to journalists, historians, and human rights advocates. At first, many felt unheard. The world's attention focused on Auschwitz, on Dachau, on Buchenwald, on the camps liberated earlier and the mass graves uncovered by American and British cameras. Ravensbrück, a women's camp hidden deep in the German countryside, did not receive immediate recognition. Many survivors felt invisible, overshadowed by the larger machinery of genocide elsewhere. But justice came. Not quickly, not fully, but it came. The first Ravensbrück trial occurred in Hamburg between 1946 and 1947. Former guards stood before Allied judges. Women who had once screamed orders across the roll call square now stood trembling in court. Survivors testified with courage, recounting beatings, executions, medical experiments, forced sterilizations, starvation, and gas chamber selections. Their voices shook, but they spoke. Some asked to show their scars. Others described the deaths of friends. They named names. They demanded the world listen. Several SS women, including Greta Bösel, Dorothea Binz, and others responsible for selections, were sentenced to death. Others received long prison sentences. Karl Gebhardt and other doctors responsible for experiments were tried at the Nuremberg doctors' trial and executed. Many nurses faced justice too, an unprecedented moment in history, where the world confronted not only male perpetrators, but the women who had embraced cruelty. Yet justice was uneven. Many perpetrators escaped. Some guards returned to ordinary lives, never held accountable. Some doctors resumed medical careers. Some SS women fled to other countries, blending into new communities. Survivors asked, again and again, how can the world move on when so many of our tormentors walk free? There was no answer. But the survivors refused to let Ravensbrück be forgotten. They wrote memoirs. They formed associations. They met at reunions. They returned to the camp, laying flowers beside the lake, standing before the crematorium ruins, tracing the outlines of the barracks that once held their suffering. They told their stories in schools, universities, newspapers, films. They brought with them scraps of paper that had survived the war, secret lists of the rabbits, hidden notes recording the deaths, sketches of torture rooms, poems written on cement sacks. They preserved history in the only way they could, with their memories. As Europe rebuilt itself, Ravensbrück became a site of remembrance. Not immediately. At first, few wanted to confront the horrors of the women's camp. But over time, memorial stones were placed, exhibitions created, archives collected. A museum rose from the ashes, honoring the victims and the survivors. Their names were engraved, their photographs displayed, their stories told with dignity. Visitors walked the grounds, quiet, respectful, shaken. They felt the cold wind that had once cut through thin prisoner dresses. They saw the lake where women had gazed longingly, dreaming of escape. They stepped into reconstructed barracks and smelled the rough wood, imagining hundreds of bodies pressed together, sharing breath, sharing fear, sharing hope. They entered the crematorium ruins and fell silent. But Ravensbrück was not only a place of death. It was also a place of astonishing resilience. For every act of brutality, there had been an act of resistance. For every murder, there had been a gesture of compassion. For every scream, there had been a whisper of defiance. The women of Ravensbrück did not survive by luck alone. They survived because they held one another up, literally and metaphorically. They shared crumbs. They hid the weak. They sabotaged machines. They memorized names. They formed families from strangers. They kept each other alive even when everything around them urged them to give up. They survived because they refused to surrender their humanity. That is the legacy of Ravensbrück. Not only suffering, not only death, but courage. In the years after the war, survivors often struggled to describe what they had endured. How could language contain starvation, torture, medical mutilation, gas chambers, death marches, and psychological destruction? Many felt that words were too fragile to express the weight of memory. Yet they spoke anyway, because silence would have been another victory for their captors. They spoke for the women who did not survive, the ones whose names vanished in smoke, whose bodies became ash, whose stories lived only in the memories of those who cared to remember. They spoke for the rabbits, whose scarred legs testified to brutality and resistance. They spoke for the mothers who lost their children, for the Jewish women murdered in the gas chamber, for the Roma women erased from history, for every prisoner who took her last breath behind those fences. And they spoke for the world, warning what happens when cruelty becomes policy, when ideology becomes weaponized, when ordinary people transform into perpetrators, when women are dehumanized, when silence replaces justice. Today, Ravensbruck stands not as ruins, but as memory made physical, a place that demands reflection, grief, and vigilance. Visitors walk the grounds feeling the weight of absence, the presence of the past lingering like mist. They hear echoes if they listen closely, the scrape of wooden clogs on gravel, the whisper of women forming secret resistance, the cries of mothers holding dying infants, the prayers murmured inside the gas chamber, the stillness after liberation. The women of Ravensbruck live on in these echoes. They live on in the testimonies they left behind. They live on in the names carved into memorials. They live on in the stories told to new generations. They live on because the world remembers, because the survivors insisted on being heard, insisted that Ravensbruck would not disappear into the shadows of history again. And ultimately, that is the final victory of those who endured the camp. Not survival alone, but remembrance. Not justice alone, but legacy. Their story warns us. Their story teaches us. Their story binds us to the truth. Ravensbruck was built to destroy them, but they endured. They resisted. They remembered. And now, through this telling, through every voice that refuses to let silence win, they live.